Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. For the first time in 8 months since Hermione had appeared in Westeros, things were quiet. The destruction of Harrenhal, well, as much as they could destroy it, thought Hermione ruefully was the last major campaign that Robb had planned. There was downtime, but importantly, training for soldiers under his banner. Robb was catching up on paperwork and planning his next moves with input from his lords in council, but everyone's watching what Stannis Baratheon would be doing. The man in his fleet had disappeared from Storm's End, and the information Hermione brought back in her binder helped support that from their spy network. The question was, where was he going? North or south? In the meantime, the servants of Riverrun were kept busy as Robb's 20th birthday, name day in Westeros, was approaching. A 3-day banquet was being prepared for the king's honor, and while Catelyn would have once upon a time been helping, Robb had forbidden her from doing so. The resulting argument had been heard 2 floors down and 1 floor up from where she was confined to her bedchambers, or her father's, where he was on his deathbed. Hermione, who had been in her bedchamber on the same floor as the Stark family, perked up at the sound of angry shouting. She stood from her desk where she was browsing several of her Hogwarts pilfered texts. She had an idea for Robb and his men to return north, but wanted to ensure all her notes were fully compiled before presenting them. Would not allow it, and you did it anyway. Robb's voice grew louder and angrier. She shared a glance with Torrhen, who sat in one of the chairs near the fireplace, constantly with her as her guard. He frowned and stood from the chair, not going for his sword that rested against the wooden structure, but for his present dagger. Just because they were in a supposedly safe environment didn't mean that he shouldn't be on his guard. I did it for the girls. I have 5 children, and only 2 of them are free. Catelyn's voice was pleading. Robb let out a humorless laugh. And why is that, Mother? I was free due to circumstance, and Arya is only here because of Lady Hermione. The voices were not growing louder, but they were clear. Another voice interjected, and Hermione realized with a start it was Lord Stark speaking disdainfully to his king's mother. I lost 1 son fighting by your son's side. Harrenhal is a prisoner of the Lannisters, and the stranger knows whether he is alive or not. You committed treason because your children are prisoners. I would carve out my heart and offer it to the father if he would let my Harrenhal free and walk through the main gate of Riverrun tomorrow. There was silence, and then Catelyn said, quietly, making Hermione strain to hear, I grieve for your son, my lord. She shook her head. Bad idea, Catelyn. Bad idea. We don't want your grief. We want vengeance. It was another voice that spoke, and Hermione frowned, trying to place it. It wasn't a Riverlands lord. She was familiar with most of them through Blackwood and Bracken at this point, so it was perhaps a northern lord.
Killing Jaime Lannister.
Or any other Lannister we have as a prisoner would not buy freedom to your Harrenhal, Lord Stark, said Catelyn stiffly. But returning him to King's Landing free of marks and mutilation may buy life for my Sansa. There was a pause, and then she added frostily, You do remember that she is now princess. Hermione sucked in air quickly through her teeth and shared another look with Torrhen, who looked torn between sharing her sentiments of Catelyn's chosen retort and accidentally eavesdropping on his king. We've discussed this before, Mother, said Robb, his voice low and still thrumming with anger. Jaime Lannister has played you for a fool. You have weakened our position. You brought discord into our camp, and you did all behind my back. I did this for you, snapped Catelyn. For the girls, for our family. Robb scoffed loudly. Mother, this conversation goes around in circles. It hasn't changed. You believe in your point, and I believe in mine. I have not changed my mind. You will remain under house arrest in your chambers or in grandfather's. You will remain guarded at all times. I cannot even join you at your council. There was a moment of incredulous silence. Why in the gods would you be allowed to sit on the council after your poor decisions? Asked Robb eventually. There was a rustle of clothing. No, Mother, you are just lucky that no one has asked for your execution. Catelyn gasped. There was the sound of several boots and the rustle of skirts, and then a door far down the hall slammed shut. Hermione eased forward and poked her head out of the door to her room, something she left open often now as Arya came by when she could, and saw Robb standing with Rickard Karstark, Great John Umber, Brynden Tully, Maggie Mormont, his Kingsguard, and the unknown Lord Hermione was not familiar with. Robart Glover. Do we have plans or any news regarding the Kingslayer? Asked Robb, his voice tired. Umber paused. Nothing yet. And how many men did we send on pursuit of him? He asked, closing his eyes and rubbing his forehead with the curled edge of his fist. 40, Your Grace, said Glover. Robb sighed. Send another 40 with our fastest horses. Yes, Your Grace. He then turned and saw Hermione watching quietly. With a low murmur, he excused himself from the group. Mormont, Karstark, and Umber turned to complete his orders. Karstark giving Hermione a smile and polite nod, with Glover a step behind them, but with an unreadable glance over his shoulder. Tully sighed and turned towards Catelyn's chambers to speak with her. Lady Hermione, greeted Robb, reaching forward for her hand and giving her a bow over it. Robb greeted Hermione in response, turning a bit. Want to come in? I might have a plan for Jaime Lannister. Curious, Robb stepped past her into her chambers, nodding at Torrhen, who relaxed his hold on the dagger, and then moved to stand by the door as Robb and Hermione went to her desk. Are these all your text? Asked Robb curiously, flipping to the cover on one and reading the title, Wards for the Wary Wizard. Hermione grinned. Yes, the magical world has a thing for alliteration, but also protection, especially since we were through 2 wars in less than 20 years. Wards are invisible domes of protection, I suppose. I can weave them into a property and they serve all manner of purposes. Like Raventry Hall and Stonehenge, said Robb, eyes flicking to hers. Just so, she replied with a grin. And this will help with the Kingslayer? Asked Robb, turning back to the book. Hermione rolled her lower lip into her mouth and began chewing it, shaking her head. Not quite. I was thinking of wards for the issue of the Riverlands not being protected when you go north, so a side project, really. No, I think it's best that when we get Jaime Lannister back, I ward him into a singular room and only key it to me. This way we can eliminate any variables, but I meant about finding him. She pulled one book from a stack and handed it to him. Here. Robb took the book, reading the title aloud and then opening it to the page Hermione had bookmarked, Finding the Forgotten. Which passage? Hermione crowded next to him, leaning forward and pressing into his arm as she pointed out the relevant passage. At her side, Robb inhaled sharply, looking down at her and her curly hair, pulled back and held together with her numerous quills, a throwback to when he saw her in her tent so long ago. He felt himself blush and struggled to focus on the relevant passage. This one, she was saying, see? It says that I can use something left over of his blood if we have it as best, or hair if not, and I can scry. She made a face. I don't particularly like the idea of using divination, especially to find his location. I'm pretty sure we don't have blood, so I can't make another map like I did for your siblings. With hair, I might be able to do a one-time scry, but I'll want to do an arithmetic equation first for success. I will ensure you can come and go from the room we had him imprisoned in freely, said Robb. What will this scry do? Hermione shrugged, her shoulder rubbing against him. I'll either have a vision of him and where he might be, or I'll see it in a dream. She frowned thoughtfully. Maybe in a bowl of water? She hummed under her breath and leaned forward over the desk, reaching for a book called Unfogging the Future and muttering about Trelawney and useless bint. It seemed like she had entirely forgotten that he was there, standing next to her. Robb smiled fondly down at her, with Hermione unable to see the softening of his face. She was really quite remarkable. His tiny little witch, she had helped him so much, and he knew that his thoughts and feelings toward her were not at all friendly, but something more. However, his mother's deal with Walder Frey hung over him like an executioner's sword. A reminder that he promised to marry one of Frey's many daughters, or granddaughters, or great-granddaughters, and elevate her to a queen in return for his help and the ability to cross the trident. He could not forget that, and even if he wanted to tell Hermione how he felt, it would not dishonor her. But still, he sought her company. He liked her. She wanted to please, be helpful, but she also had a hard edge to her that he did enjoy as well. His eyes drifted from the top of her curly brown hair, the woman completely lost in her research as she muttered to herself and reached for a quill and inkpot to scribble notes, to Torrhen, who was watching them with a knowing look in his eyes. Robb immediately snapped to attention and stood straight. He cleared his throat and stepped back, leaving the warmth and heat of Hermione's body. How much time do you need for this scrying, Hermione? What? Her head popped up. Oh, I don't know, maybe an hour or two. I can do the equation now. I just need his hair, I guess. The spell isn't hard.
Very well, said Robb, giving her a small smile. I shall leave you to continue your work.
Hermione took an unconscious step forward, and in his direction, "Oh, no, I mean, you don't have to go. I have a few other things to work on. Correspondence and training," said Robb gently, pleased that she wanted to spend time with him. "Perhaps you'll be free this afternoon. Before evening meal, we could go for a stroll around the gardens, and you can tell me your plan for these wards, and how it'll help." Hermione beamed. "Of course, until later then." Robb itched to stretch forward and affectionately touch her cheek in response. Instead, he bowed his head and said, "Until then." Torrhen waited until Robb left the room to speak. "Why don't you two just kiss already?" "Oh, shut up, Torrhen," snapped Hermione, blushing a furious pink across her cheeks and neck. Turning back to her books. A few hours later, Arya decided that following Hermione was far more interesting than the needlepoint lesson her mother had scheduled for her. Hermione, who had several sheets of notes for the attempted scry, decided that it was best to cast the spell while in Jaime Lannister's room/cell, the place he spent the most time in while at Riverrun. "What's this gonna do?" asked Arya, keeping up with Hermione's long strides. Hermione had given her a conjured container for any collections of the Kingslayer's hair. The young teen was all legs and arms and barely reached Hermione's shoulder, but moved with the unconscious grace of a dancer, or, thought Hermione, a rather dangerous girl who has killed and seen battle. "Hopefully find Jaime Lannister," replied Hermione. "How?" Hermione refrained from sighing as Arya peppered her with questions. Behind her, Torrhen stifled a snicker. "I'm going to use something from him like a piece of hair, and cast the spell. The spell itself is a form of divination." She couldn't help but wrinkle her nose. "Here, and it will allow me to see from his eyes briefly. My plan is that, if I can see where he is, I can either apparate to him or create a portkey and bring a few others with me to capture him." "Capture?" Arya wrinkled up her nose and spat the word out. "Why not kill him?" Hermione stopped and stared at the dark-haired girl at her side. "Well, why kill him?" Arya stared at her, her steely gray eyes meeting Hermione's. The witch felt a frisson of something zing up her spine in response. There was something otherworldly about her eyes. After a few beats, Hermione turned and continued walking towards the room Jaime Lannister had been imprisoned in. The room was still bare, just a lumpy mattress and a few chairs and side tables. However, the pillows and sheets were still on the bed, and Hermione counted that as a win. Torrhen stood by the door, watching. Arya hovered in the doorway. "Now what?" Hermione tossed her hair over her shoulder as she grinned at the young Stark girl. "Want to see some magic?" The answering grin on Arya's face had Hermione chuckle. Her wand slid smoothly into her waiting hand, and, posing dramatic like a conductor, Hermione held her wand aloft. Then, with a delicate flick, Hermione used nonverbal magic to pinpoint any remnants of Jaime Lannister's DNA. A few pieces here and there began to glow, predominantly on the bed, by the pillow, and a few on the floor near the fireplace. With precision, Hermione floated a few pieces of glowing DNA towards her, and Arya, eager to be her helper, raced forward. She held the container under one of the glowing pieces, looking like a hovering glowworm, and watched with wide eyes as Hermione used her wand to direct the piece into the container. They did this a few times until Hermione had collected what was left in the room. "Excellent," she said, pleased. With a smile on her face, "Now let's get the bowl and fill it with water." Torrhen turned to the hallway, calling for a nearby servant to help, and then asking for water. Hermione found a nice spot in the middle of the room and sat cross-legged. Arya copied her on the other side, nearly vibrating in excitement. As they waited, Hermione had Arya place the contained at the side, and Hermione eyed the pillow on the bed. With a deft flick of her wrist, the pillow zoomed through the air and she caught it, eliciting a gasp from Arya and wide, wide eyes. A tap on the pillow had it transfigure into a shallow, beige-colored bowl that went in front of Hermione on the floor, between the two females. Soon, a maid hurried into the room carrying a pail of water that sloshed as she walked. "Where would you like the water, milady?" she asked, turning to Hermione. "Just here is fine, thank you, Allison," said Hermione, smiling winningly at the maid who curtsied and smiled back, pleased that Hermione remembered her name. "Of course, milady," said Allison. "And if there's anything else you need, milady." "No, I'm good," said Hermione. And the girl disappeared. Across from her, Arya was snickering, trying hard to bury her face in her shoulder. "It's like you say jump, and they wonder how high." Hermione sighed. "I know. And I've tried correcting them 100 times to just call me Hermione, but it's always Lady Hermione this or Milady that." Arya tilted her head. Were you not Lady Hermione, though? Hermione shook her head. Where I come from, I'm just Hermione Granger. If you want to put any titles on me, I hold an Order of Merlin, first-class medal, and a professor once called me the brightest witch of my age. But my parents are dentists, specialized tooth master, and we're certainly not titled in any way. Who started calling you Lady Hermione then? Asked Arya, fascinated. And don't you like it? All the girls, like Sansa, love being called Milady and wearing dresses and thinking about knights and songs. Yuck. Hermione grinned. I will admit there's something about dressing up and looking and feeling great, she began, thinking back to the reactions she got at the Yule Ball on Victor's arm, or the red dress she wore to Bill and Fleur's wedding. But overall, I'm not a girly girl, and as for who began calling me that, it was your brother. And Earl rolled her eyes. Of course it was Robb. What does that mean? Asked Hermione, using her wand to balance the heavy pail and pour the water into the bowl. Nothing, replied Arya, eyes following the trail of water coming from the hovering pail. Hermione huffed, but didn't speak, concentrating on her magic doing the task she wanted. Once the bowl was filled, she nodded at the container, and Arya nudged it with her foot closer to Hermione. From there, a single strand of blonde hair rose and hovered above the bowl. Then the glow began to turn golden, and it disintegrated, the particles floating down like large pieces of snow into the water. With her finger and some wandless magic, Hermione gestured in tiny circles, and the particles swirled together. Then she leaned over her crossed legs and peered into the clear water, peering intently. According to the book she read, she had to clear her mind, so vary occlumency, and concentrate on the person she was searching for. The images might be clear or not. Water scrying was tricky, fickle. She needed to be calm, centered, and at peace with herself. Distantly, she heard Arya shift, or move, but Hermione focused on the bottom of the shallow bowl, her eyes nearly going cross-eyed as she did so. After a bit, she felt her breathing deepen, and her limbs relax. Her hands on her knees shifted to the side, and her fingers slowly relaxed their tense grip. The clear white blue of the water began to deepen, turning dense, cloudy, and murky. The murky blue turned into green, and black began to bleed into the watery image. Distantly, Hermione could hear voices. It doesn't matter how loyal a servant you are, no one enjoys the company of a humorless mute. Trust me on this. People have been serving me since I was born. You think Lady Stark is going to want a giant toe-headed plank following her around for the rest of her life? A week's journey with you and she'll order you to fall on your sword. If Lady Stark is unhappy with any aspect of my service, I'm sure she'll let me know. She's an honest woman. Honest but dumb, thought Hermione, eyes narrowing. The blue and black and green swirled together, and two spots of white-yellow began to appear from within. But the colors were flickering, like something was shadowed or illuminated briefly, on alternating times. For all the good it's done her, how did you come into Lady Stark's service? There's something we can talk about. Not your concern, Kingslayer. Ah, thought Hermione. I've got you. Her eyes narrowed further on the water, and she willed it to show her the truth, show her where Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth were. The colors spread and twisted until they began to resemble things she recognized, the swaying of leaves on trees, the fire in a shallow pit between two large figures, and then eventually the gleaming gold of Jaime Lannister's armor. It had to be recently, the Kingslayer was saying. You weren't with her at Winterfell. How would you know? Asked a suspicious Brienne. Jaime Lannister scoffed. Because I visited Winterfell, I would have noticed your dour head smacking into the archways. There was a pause. Then, were you pledged to Stannis? Brienne made a face. Oh, that's no. Understanding lit across the Kingslayers. There was an expression that reminded Hermione of Malfoy knowing something that Harry didn't and was ready to taunt him with. Ah, Renly. Really? He wasn't fit to rule over anything more important than a 12-course meal. Anger stole across Brienne's face. And something else. Shut your mouth. Their features began to sharpen. Hermione could make out the pallid color on Brienne's face with two splotches of distinct red from anger or embarrassment on her cheekbones. Her pale eyes were narrowed on Jaime Lannister, who, despite being in shackles, seemed completely at ease, leaning against a shoulder-height boulder that jutted from the ground. He had one knee bent and pressed near his chest. The man laughed scornfully, disdainfully. Why? I lived with him at court since he was a boy. Don't forget, could hardly escape the little tulip skipping down the corridors in his embroidered silks. I knew him far better than you. Pride shone on Brienne's face. I knew him as well as anyone. As a member of his Kingsguard, he trusted me with everything. He would have been a wonderful king. Their faces and their surroundings began to fade, their voices growing distant again, as though Hermione was listening to them from underwater. Sounds like you quite fancied him, the young Lannister was saying. There was a sharp retort cutting through the fog. I did not fancy him. Oh gods, you did. Did you ever tell him? No, of course not. You weren't Renly's type, I'm afraid. He preferred curly-haired little girls like Loras Tyrell. You're far too much man for him. I'm not interested in foul rumors. Unless they're about me, it's all true. The colors bled out and then continued to swirl in the bowl until they began to bleed out, like a painter adding too much water to their paint and watching as the color drained out, leaving a pale wash behind. Eventually, the water turned clear once more. Hermione let out a giant sigh, feeling her limbs protest as she straightened her back. What had been a midday sun was now gone. The room she was in was barely lit, with the only light coming from the fireplace and a candelabra placed on the side table. In the darkened room, Hermione let her eyes adjust the new low light and spotted several shadowed figures, including one pacing. Hermione, she started and turned, using a hand on the floor to brace herself. Robb rushed forward and knelt on the hard floor in front of her, his blue eyes wide and concerned. His hair was disheveled, and Hermione could see how tense he was with the tightness around his eyes and the flattening of his lips in a straight line. Robb, even Hermione's voice was weak. At her other side, Arya crept forward, peering anxiously into Hermione's face. Hermione, are you well? You were staring into that bowl for ages. Ages? Repeated Hermione, glancing at Arya. How long? Robb ran a hand through his hair. Hours, Hermione, hours. His hand rose and touched her cheek, softly fluttering and then quickly retreating to his side, where he clenched it into a fist. Hermione stopped and looked around. At the door, serving as guard, was Darren Hornwood and Daisy, while Torrhen was the one pacing. As her eyes fell on Torrhen, the tall Karstark stopped pacing and stepped forward, just as Arya gripped Hermione with her tiny hands, and together they rose, even though Hermione was awfully shaky. What were you thinking? Her guard demanded, gripping both her shoulders in his hands and shaking her. Arya hastily stepped back, but her eyes remained on Torrhen's form, a small snarl on her lips. Torrhen did not notice, even though Robb stood nearby. The king had a strange look on his face, his eyes darting between the two, slightly narrowed. You only had the princess here with you. Not a princess, the girl in question muttered, crossing her arms. And whatever you were doing with your magic could have harmed you, continued Torrhen, his voice rising sharply. None of us have magic, my lady. None of us can help you if something happens. Torrhen, it wasn't anything dangerous. You always say that. There was something desperate on the edge of Torrhen's words. You always push yourself ahead of everyone and everything else, Lady Hermione. You have literally collapsed in front of me from magical exhaustion. Twice. What? Barked Robb, glancing between the two with shock on his face. It's fine. The hell it is, snapped Torrhen, stepping back and running an aggravated hand over and down his face. He turned and placed his back to her, as well as his king and Arya, a significant faux pas in royal etiquette. Robb, in a slightly strangled voice, asked, Hermione, is this true? Are you exhausting yourself with your magic as you help us? Hermione turned to Robb, eyes wide. No! Torrhen scoffed. Not really, amended Hermione, throwing a hasty glance in his direction. I'm not used to using so much magic. At Hogwarts, it's ambient, just always there in the background for us to soak up and rest. This is the most I've used magic in quite some time. Since the Battle of Hogwarts, anyway. I just have to get used to it. Robb's eyebrows drew together. Really, Robb? Said Hermione, softening her voice deliberately. I'm fine. You fell unconscious after warding both Raventree Hall and Stonehenge, and when you apparated back to Harrenhal, you nearly collapsed onto Lord Bolton, interrupted Torrhen angrily. He swung around to face her again, and Hermione's eyes drew back to her friend. You can't tell me that as you, not being used to using magic, my lady. Hermione shifted uncomfortably as all eyes swung back around to her. Her eyes were wide, as she looked at everyone in the room. Daisy looked unforgiving, raising a single dark eyebrow in response to Hermione's eyes, cutting to her first, a female ally. Then Darren, who looked unmoved, his eyes moving from hers to Torrhen, and Robb, her two closest male friends in Westeros, were both looking thunderous, although a vein at Torrhen's temple was pulsing in his anger. Robb, however, while looking annoyed, was fidgeting nervously as he glanced between her and Torrhen. Arya, the last of those in the room with them, was watching the reactions of those around her carefully, as though filing everything for later use. "Look, I promise to take better care of myself, okay?" said Hermione eventually, turning to Torrhen briefly before looking back at Robb. Her eyes met his, and she marveled for a moment at the deep, dark blue. Her breath caught and her heart started pounding in her chest. "I really am sorry," she said quietly. "I'm usually the one planning things and staying on top of them, not really worrying about myself." She looked up at him earnestly. "I know my limits, Robb, I do." His eyes were flicking between hers, reading her. At one point, he glanced over at a hovering, irate Torrhen, and his features slipped into a tiny scowl, but when he looked back at her, they softened. Finally, he sighed. "You know better than us your limits with magic, Hermione." "I do. I promise I'll stop pushing myself to the edge, though," she said. "It doesn't do anyone any good if I do that." There was a stricken look on Robb's face. "Hermione, I don't..." He swallowed and looked away, his jaw tense. When he looked back, he said firmly, "We don't keep you around just because you're good at magic, my lady. We like you here. You have a place here with us." "With me" seemed to go unsaid, but Hermione wasn't sure if she was reading too much into his unspoken words. "You don't need to prove anything." "Well," said Hermione, trailing off and grinning slightly, "that's good to know. Can I tell you I know where Jaime Lannister is now?" In the end, Hermione created a portkey using the image from her scrying. Torrhen was going with her, as was Daisy. Torrhen had argued for Mor to join them, but Hermione had argued that Mor would alert Brienne and the Kingslayer that they were on to them. Eventually, Robb agreed, leaving the two to guard Hermione, represented Robb as king in the north and protector of the Trident, and for Hermione to be the one to capture the Kingslayer with her magic. Hermione didn't think it would be as easy as the first time, especially when they were known to the Kingslayer. Worse, she thought as they landed her with their bent knees, Torrhen swaying on the spot and slightly used portkey travel, and Daisy kneeling on the ground, dazed, was how far south they were. Although trees surrounded them and there was a blackened fire pit at their feet, Hermione was familiar enough with the landscape around them, the jagged rolling green hills, the boulders, and the long swaying grass. "Are we where I think we are?" asked Torrhen grimly. Hermione nodded. "Well, for those of us who don't know," said Daisy, eyeing them both, "where are we?" Hermione sighed. "Harrenhal." "What?" gaped the other woman. Her dark eyebrows shot up and she shook her long brown hair. "Are you serious? How do you know?" Torrhen pointed towards the clearing, where there were several muddy tracks and churned earth. "This was where the Bolton army was." "Come on," said Hermione, looking down at where Harrenhal once stood. There were several large remnants of the original foundations and several rocky outcrops that were once low walls and partial rooms, but it looked more like the crumbling remains of a building thousands of years old than the burned-out shell Harrenhal had been several weeks ago. The grass around the building was still tainted and tinged white and brown in places from chalky rock and fire. Without the jarring towers of Harrenhal to mar the landscape, it was obvious that the Riverlands was fundamentally changed with the destruction. "Why are we going there?" whined Daisy. "I thought you said the Kingslayer was here near this clearing." "Half the reason Robb wanted us to destroy Harrenhal was to ensure that people couldn't camp out and use Harrenhal as a defense. As a building, it was too large and too destroyed to keep functioning," explained Hermione as she began to walk towards the ruin, stepping carefully over loose stones. Terrain reached forward and helped her over some tricky spots. However, as you can see, it's still providing enough shelter. "You think he's there?" asked a surprised Daisy, bringing up the rear. Hermione shook her head. "I know. See that plume of smoke? Someone made camp in what's left." "I thought the whole point of destroying Harrenhal was to avoid that from happening," accused Daisy, her eyes dark. Hermione, looking at the other woman over her shoulder, as Torrhen moved ahead to pick his way down several large boulders, sighed. "It would have taken a few extra days to pulverize what remained into tiny rocks. Daisy, we did what we could in the period we had, but what remains of Harrenhal is nothing substantial, and certainly nothing with a roof or solid walls. There might be one strong half-wall someone can rest against, but to protect them from the elements, no. This is a pit stop now." Pit stop, a technical and slang term for a location where race car drivers... You know what? Hermione caught herself. Never mind. It's not important. As the day grew darker, the three fell silent and walked in single file towards the ruins, where the plume of smoke had deepened. They kept walking until they could duck behind what was once the outer wall and gatehouse of Harrenhal, kneeling on the damp grass and peering over the edge of the gray stones to look within. Here, they were close enough to see the flickering flame of light around several further low remaining walls that made part of the interior courtyard. Somewhere Hermione guessed was partially the kitchens, as it had been sunken. Smartly tapping Torrhen on the head, Hermione cast a disillusionment charm on him, and then Daisy, who muffled a shriek at the sensation of cracked egg running down the back of her neck. Hermione then silenced their feet with a silencio pointed at their boots and her trainers. "This is brilliant!" enthused a nearly invisible Daisy, who was looking at her hand warp the landscape and colors of the ground around her as though she blended right in. "But it won't keep us quiet," cautioned Hermione, knowing that Torrhen was sending the other woman a bemused look, as he was now a deft hand at magical responses. "So we should keep our talking to a minimum." "Very well," agreed Daisy. "To interrupt," said Torrhen, his voice grim, "I just want to mention the fact that we're still out of sight and can see a flame is worrisome. That's awfully large for just two people." Hermione frowned. "I agree. Give me a moment." "What are you going to do?" asked Torrhen quietly. "I'm going to cast Homino Revio," said Hermione, and she flicked her wand. The colorless spell washed across the ground, and tiny pinpricks of red and green and yellow, all representing different things, began to ping through her foggy vision. Torrhen grinned. "Ah, I remember this. You used it at Stonehenge when the room was full of smoke to see where the Lannister soldiers were." Hermione didn't answer. Her eyes darted back and forth as she catalogued what was in front of her, just beyond the half-wall by the kitchen's inner courtyard and the pit where Vargos and Hoat had burned the Lannister bodies. She scowled. "What is it?" whispered Daisy. "You're not going to believe this," muttered Hermione, her voice dark. She canceled the spell and turned to where Daisy and Torrhen were, the outline of their bodies shimmering in the dark. "There's at least 20 people there. One is in the pit, alive, but with an animal of some sort." "An animal?" repeated Torrhen, aghast. "In a pit? The same pit where—" "Well," said Daisy, strangely cheerful, "this does change things. Has the Kingslayer met up with other Lannister soldiers, you think?" Loud laughter swept across the ground then, strong enough that it startled the three of them. Then there were jeers and laughs. Hermione could ever swear she heard them singing some song about a bear and a maiden. Hermione sighed. Only one way to find out. Then she crept forward, around the outer wall. She felt the air behind her move as Torrhen followed, and then Daisy, the three kept to the shadows as much as they could, Torrhen and Daisy moving instinctively like they were not disillusioned under a spell. Torrhen eased past Hermione, going first with a slight touch to her shoulder. They crept over rubble and up a series of half-broken and collapsed stairs that were once part of the wall, probably something that led to the second floor. They used the high ground to gain an elevated view of what was beyond the wall. When they rounded the corner of the stairs at the highest wall that separated them from the courtyard, Hermione stifled a gasp at what she saw. The pit that they had burned the Lannister bodies in had been cleared out of corpses and no longer resembled a mass grave. Instead, what wooden beams were salvaged from the destruction spells, and the fire had been used to create two walkways overtop the pit. The pit itself had been deepened and was now being used as a sunken arena. And in that arena was Brienne of Tarth in a ripped and bloody dress that was ill-suited for her large frame, a wooden sword in front of her as her only means of defense. Her neck was gashed by 3 long scratches from an animal's paw swipe, and the blood dripped down her collarbones and onto the deep burgundy dress. Across from her, muzzle bloody and snarling with saliva dripping, was a large black bear. Around the pit, jeering, stood many men with no discernible colors to show whose army they belonged to. In fact, when Torrhen swore next to her, Hermione realized that she knew these men. Her eyes were drawn to the familiar lean and hungry-looking man who was on a raised platform, able to look down into the pit without anything obstructing his view. He lounged on his makeshift throne, leaning forward over his knee and a hand hanging in a relaxed manner, while the other held a dented goblet, sloshing with some liquid. He tipped his head back, laughing uproariously as the bear lunged forward and Brienne dodged, bringing his goblet to his mouth and letting the liquid dribble down his long goatee. "The brave companions," she whispered. Daisy, on her other side, scoffed. "Nothing brave about this lot." "It's that gods be damned hote," muttered Torrhen darkly. "Bloody sellswords?" "Where's the Kingslayer?" muttered Daisy, eyes trying to spot the gleaming man in gold. Hermione, realizing that he was missing, began to scan the faces of the men in the crowd. The crowd began laughing, taking up their song again. Horrified, Hermione watched as Brienne swiped at the bear with her wooden sword, roaring in its face as it went up on its hind legs. A bear there was. A bear, all black and brown, and covered with hair. The bear. "Oh, come," they said. "Oh, come to the fair." "The fair," said he, "but I'm a bear, all black and brown, and covered with hair." The man sang, many off-key and out of tune with the others. On his throne, Hote heaved a great sigh, loudly calling, well, thief, eat one, fempin full, fucking perform dance, thop, running, and fight. "We need to do something," begged Hermione. "What do you propose?" asked Daisy, her voice tinged with annoyance. "Lady Hermione, there are at least 20 of them, and 3 of us." "We've faced worse," said Torrhen absently. He leaned forward, and a tiny bit of loose stone from the top of the wall they were peering over scattered and fell down the side. "Careful," hissed Daisy. "Look, we need to save Brienne," argued Hermione, mindful to keep her voice low, even though the men singing wouldn't be likely to hear her anyway. And if she's here, then so is Jaime Lannister. So let's figure this out first. "Like how to save Tarth," sighed Daisy. "Fine. Can you magic yourself down there?" "Yes, of course." Hermione cut herself off as a dirty man purposefully strode towards the crowd. She barely recognized him without the gleaming golden armor, as he was dressed in a dull brown leather jacket and riding trousers, both smeared with dirt and blood. His once shining blonde hair was darkened with grime to a light brown, and there was a beard on his face. He pushed his way through to the edge of the pit and stared down. Hermione only saw the side of his face, but it was enough to realize he was angry. He turned back to Hote, glaring up at him. "A wooden sword?" Hote stared down at him. "Thought you'd gone." "So did I," muttered Daisy. Hermione nudged her shoulder into the other woman in reprimand. The Kingslayer repeated himself, incredulously. "You gave her a wooden sword?" Hote shrugged. "You only got one there." Tammy spun back around as Brienne's sword was snatched from her by a giant paw. She hollered and backpedaled, but the bear advanced with a roar. "I'm going down," said Torrhen suddenly. "If Daisy and I start on the far end across from Hote, can you apparate into the pit, Lady Hermione?" "Yes," she said firmly. "We'll need to make a mad dash out, though," said Daisy. She sighed. "Well, I suppose it's up to you, then, to save Brienne of Tarth and capture the Kingslayer again." "Not a problem," said Hermione, feeling vicious. "I'll pay her bloody ransom, or my father will pay. A Lannister always pays their debts. Gold, sapphires, whatever you want." The Kingslayer was shouting at Hote, desperation tinging his voice. "Just get her out of there." Hote sneered down at the man, and Hermione felt Daisy and Torrhen make their way back down the stairs. She remained perched at the top of the crumbling wall, eyes glued to the scene in front of her. She could Acatio Brienne, but it was draw attention too quickly. What else could she do? Frowning, Hermione muttered a tripping hex on the bear and watched as it landed heavily on its feet, giving Brienne time to move to another part of the pit among the jeers of those watching. "Thou get in any trouble, all thou got to do, thou, for my father, and that's it," said Hote. And Hermione was painfully reminded of Draco Malfoy, although her classmate had a much more pronounced, panicked look on his face than Jaime Lannister did. "All thou lords and ladies, thou till think that the only thing that matters it gold. All your troubles are gone." He waved his arm, and 2 of his brave companions moved forward, seizing Jaime Lannister. The man shouted and threw one off. But another took the man's place. There was a grapple with the blonde Lannister throwing a punch and even kicking one man in the stomach. But eventually, 3 more brave companions came forward. One punched the Lannister hard in the stomach and he doubled over. Another backhanded him and his head flew to the side. He moaned something, but turned his head back to face Hote, who was staring at him. "Have thou got something today?" the lean man asked, cruelty lining his face. "Come on, Torrhen, Daisy. Where are you?" thought Hermione nervously, glancing back at the pit. The bear got back to its feet and roared at Brienne, and it lunged forward. A terrified scream cut through the air as a giant paw knocked into her side, and sent her sprawling. At the same time, one of the companions kicked Jaime in the back of the knee and he fell heavily to the ground, grimacing in pain. "I don't want to say the wrong thing. They're nothing without your daddy, and your daddy it in here." Never forget that. Hoat stood from his stone, makeshift throne and loomed over him. He brought out his sword, slowly releasing it from his scabbard at his side, all the while walking down the steps that made his throne rise above the crowd. Horror crept up Hermione's spine. "Oh no. Oh no. Please. No." One of the companions forced Jaime Lannister to the ground and drew his right hand over an uneven block of stone left behind from her bombardment. "Here, this'll help. You remember," snarled Hoat, and with a sure swing, he brought down his sword. The swing was fast and sure. The blade cut through Jaime Lannister's flesh and bone. The brave companions holding him down leapt back once the sword finished its arc. Blood immediately began pooling onto the stone, but it took Jaime Lannister a moment to process what happened. He stared at what was his right hand, tiny burst of blood spitting up and around the sleeve of his shirt. Then his mouth opened and he yelled. Over his shouts, Hoat laughed. "Thidik makes me happier than all Thurgold ever could, and that," he finished off by punctuating in Brienne's direction, "in the pit, makes me happier than all her Thapfires. Thurgold buy Thurthelf a golden hand and fuck Thurthelf with it." Hermione could wait no longer. She stood, canceled the disillusionment charm on herself, and shouted, her wand pointed at the bear. "Defendo!" The red light soared over the suddenly confused and shocked brave companions and slashed a jagged red line across the bear's flank, which spurted blood. The bear roared and twisted to see its new enemy. Oates' face went red, and he turned on his heel to face the pit. "What the fuck is going on with my bear?" Hermione apparated, landing directly in front of Brienne, and shot off another cutting curse, this time catching the bear across the other side. It howled as blood poured down its fur, matting it. It began to hobble, listing to the side as it called out in pain. Hermione leapt back, hoping to avoid being covered. She was running out of blood-free clothes at this point. With, Hoat shouted, mispronouncing which entirely. "Kill her! Kill her!" Hermione swore under her breath and turned to face Brienne, who was on the ground behind her. Her face was pale, and there were bruises under her eyes, and one cheek was already swelling. The blood from the cut on her neck was beginning to clot. "Can you stand?" gasped Hermione, glancing up and casting a protego as a few companions grabbed bows and began raining arrows on them. The metal-tipped projectiles bounced off her shield, but she grimaced as she felt each one hit. Bran gaped. Yes, my lady." "Good, do so," commanded Hermione, glancing up towards the men leered over them. There was a shout and then cries. Torrhen and Dacey had joined, and the crowd was split into two. Those fighting two angry Northern Kingsguards and those who wanted to follow Hoat's orders and kill her. "Get behind me," said Hermione, as Brienne stood and shakily made her way behind the smaller woman. "Now what?" the taller woman gasped. "Hold on to me." Brienne reached forward and did so gingerly. Once Hermione was sure she had a grasp, she dropped the spell on her shield and spun on her heel, apparated them out of the pit. They reappeared near Hoat's throne, even though the man had moved towards the pit when she revealed herself. Brienne turned green and fell to her knees, coughing up spittle. The men nearest turned at the sound of her crack, their sword raised. Hermione snapped up her wand and shouted, panicked, "Stupefy!" The man dropped to the ground, and those around her paused, staring at him and then her. Some had seen what she could do during their retaking of Harrenhal, but most were unsure of her abilities. Spurred on by her own anger and horror at what she witnessed, Hermione slashed her wand, vanishing the swords right out the hands of the men nearest her. A few cried out in shock, but she wasn't done. She non-verbally cast Ventus, flicking her wand in the whip-like motion the wind Jinx called for. A strong gush of cold air blasted from her wand and sent those nearest her flying back, knocking into one another like dominoes. The furthest from the spell, those standing by the pit, fell in, screaming. A roar from the bear told Hermione that it was attacking its newest friends in the pit, and she grinned. A large circle had appeared around Hermione now, with a significant portion of the companions cut down by either Dacey or Torrhen, or by Hermione's spell. Jaime Lannister was revealed, pale-faced, sweating, and clutching his stump with his good left hand. Brienne, who was shakily making it to her feet, cried out at the sight of him and stumbled forward. Hermione began making her way towards him as well, protecting Brienne by banishing sharp stone remnants towards some companions, watching as the stone cut their faces or knocked them to the ground, unconscious if they were large enough. She transfigured a few larger pieces that made up the crumbled wall of the kitchens into the wolves she had used before at Harrenhal, and the men who recognized the spell broke formation and ran further into the ruins. Hoot was screaming above them all, shouting to kill her, to stop her, but men were either being cut down by Torrhen and Daisy or running away. Eventually, the two made it to her side. Both were bloodied, but in good spirits, despite Daisy having a long, thin cut on her arm. "Time to go!" she shouted. "Grab onto me," replied Hermione, leaning down to help Brienne haul Jaime to his feet. The man's pale face turned off-white, and Hermione was afraid he was going to throw up. She felt Torrhen grab her around the middle, and Daisy clutch at her sleeve. Using their portkey, Torrhen's pouch, Hermione shouted, "Hufflepuff!" They ripped through the air and traveled the distance of hundreds of miles in an instant and crumpled together in a giant mess on the floor of the very room Jaime Lannister had been imprisoned in while at Riverrun. The man himself was crying, tears running down his face as he landed hard on his bloodied stump when they arrived. Brienne was sick, curled on her side and clutching her ribs. Torrhen and Daisy, on the other hand, had rolled to their feet. Shouts and the sound of running boots caught Hermione's attention, and she crawled forward until she was abreast to the Kingslayer. She had her wand out and began casting healing spells on the man's stump. She wasn't sure what to use, what could heal a severed limb, but began with Snape's counterspell to Sacrum Sceptra, the musical Latin spilling from her mouth as she traced her wand tip around the stump. Vulnera Sanentur. The still gushing wound began to clot, slowly. So she said it again, poking this time, Vulnera Santur. Then, a hand grabbed her by the shoulder and yanked her back. She gasped, spinning to face Robb. "Hermione, what are you doing?" "I'm healing his wound," she snapped back, shrugging his hand off. "But why?" pressed Daisy with a scowl. The dark-haired woman was standing bookended with Torrhen Brienne between them. Both had their hands clasped on the woman's arms, holding her in place as she struggled and stared hard at the man on the floor, blood still pooling around his stump and staining the ground. "Why not?" snapped back Hermione. "We're all human here, aren't we? Why is his life worth any less of ours?" She turned to face Robb, who was staring down at her. "We've had this conversation before, remember? About being a good man and doing the right thing. The easy thing would be letting Jaime Lannister die, Robb. Maybe then you'll get your vengeance, but you won't get your answers." Robb swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he then nodded, once quickly. "Help him." Hermione turned back to the man, moaning on the floor. The blood began to clot and seal over, so she used Turjo to siphon off the blood and flicked it towards the fireplace. The blood hit the fire, making it spit and sizzle. "Help me hold him down," ordered Hermione, and Robb, slowly but then with speed, knelt beside Hermione and pushed Jaime Lannister onto his back, and then pressed down on his shoulders. "Your Grace," someone breathily cautioned from the room, but Hermione didn't look up, able to see the wound more clearly. Now that the Kingslayer wasn't curled up around it, Hermione swallowed her bile at the sight of bone and ragged muscle and tendons. Reparo she cast, knowing the mending charm wasn't necessarily for healing, but she needed the worst of the wound to be healed. She cast again, and once more, until she felt that it jump-started the natural healing process. She then pointed her wand in the air and summoned Essence of Dittany in her beaded bag in one go, non-verbally. A few moments later, someone shrieked out in the hall. Her bag flew through the open door, and Hermione directed it to the ground beside her. Her free hand caught the bottle of potion, and she began to drip it onto the wound, where it sizzled and hissed, smoke wafting up from it, Jaime shouted, and Robb grit his teeth, holding the man down as he began to spasm and fight against him. Suddenly, Eddard Stark was there next to his king, helping. The combined weight of the men worked, and then Jaime Lannister slipped into unconsciousness. "Is it supposed to do that?" asked Robb, watching her carefully. She nodded, leaning back on her heels and taking in a few deep breaths. "That's it. I've done what I can. You'll want Maester Vyman to look him over." "Of course," agreed Robb, letting go of the Kingslayer's shoulders and sitting back. Eddard hefted the man into his arms and dragged him to the bed, depositing him on it none too gently. Robb stood and extended a hand to Hermione, almost absently as he stared at the man who his mother had freed. Hermione took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet, causing his attention to shift. "I take it none of you caused his wound?" he asked, still holding on to her hand as he glanced over at Torrhen, Daisy, and Brienne, finishing on her with narrowed eyes. "No, your grace," replied Daisy, straightening her back. "We encountered Vargo Hoat at what remains of Harrenhal. He was with his brave companions, and he cut the Kingslayer's hand off." "Serves the bastard right," rumbled the great John, stepping further into the room and glaring murderously at the unconscious man. "Couldn't have happened to a better man." Robb frowned, but didn't say anything. Hermione, however, scowled. He just lost an essential limb, Lord Umber, in an incredibly violent and humiliating manner. "And he's helped kill friends and men of mine, my lady," countered the large man. "Don't think I'll forget that. What good has he done for us? For me? To outweigh any past ill deeds?" "He tried to save Brienne's life," argued Hermione, gesturing towards the woman with the hand not in Robb's. Omorace's eyebrows tried being the key word there. Hermione stomped a foot and went to cross her arms, only to realize that Robb still had one. She glanced at it, and then him and he hurriedly dropped her hand and stepped to the side, clearing his throat as he did so. "We'll discuss this later," he said, looking at everyone pointedly. "After we've had some sleep. After all, it's late." He turned back to Hermione. "Can you ward the room?" "I'll do it, so I'm the only one who can get in here." She agreed, nodding. "Good," replied Robb. "Later, though, I can have several men stand guard until you've rested." "We can't meet to discuss this in the morning," countered Umber, glancing from the Kingslayer to Robb. "Nor will Lady Hermione have time to ward the room and rest." Hermione frowned. "Why not?" "It's his Grace's name day celebrations," explained Umber. "Surely you remember, Lady Hermione." Hermione's mouth dropped open, and she mentally counted back from when she was discussing it last with Torrhen. Merlin, she thought. That snuck up on me quickly. With a frown, she looked at Robb, then the great John, Jaime Lannister's still form, and then back at Robb. "Well," she began, running a hand through her messy hair. She suddenly wanted to take a bath in her tent with her shampoo and body wash, and not the soap the maids had provided her with. She was so very tired, all of a sudden, not physically tired, but mentally tired. "I'm going to bed then. I'll find time soon to ward the room to relieve the guards, and to check on his wound." She turned and began walking away. "Wait, Lady Hermione." Hermione stopped and looked at Robb, waiting for him to speak. When nothing was said, she nodded and sighed. "Good night, Robb." And she paused, glancing pointedly at Jaime Lannister. "Happy birthday. I hope it's what you want." She nodded once more at the Great John and walked away. The next morning, Hermione was well rested, but still rather irritated. Her hair seemed to reflect this, bushing out a bit more than normal, fighting against her hands as she stared at her reflection in a mirror that hung above her drawers in her bedroom in the tent. She yanked the strands back and combed them into a collection in one hand as she tried to loop a hair tie around the thick curls to make a sloppy bun. "Oh, honey, that's just not going to work," the mirror in dulcet, sympathetic tones cooed at her. Hermione scowled. She gave an aggravated grunt when she pulled too hard at one point, finally giving up and letting her hair wall in natural tangled curls around and down her shoulders. "It's going to be one of those days," she muttered instead. "Is it?" the mirror asked, clucking. Hermione's scowl deepened. "I really hate talking mirrors. Why do wizards like them again?" Although, she looked contemplatively at the bland mirror hanging there on the wall. Not all wizarding mirrors were bad, particularly that very interesting set that James Potter and Sirius Black shared, the one half that Sirius gave Harry in their 5th year. Maybe I can give Robb a bit more of his family back before we figure out ways to get Sansa, Bran, and Rickon physically here, she thought, an idea taking root. Her mood slightly buoyed, Hermione began rummaging through her drawers, pulling open the top drawer first, and searching through whatever clothing she had left in it over the year they were on the run, shoving aside jumpers and t-shirts. When that drawer remained elusive, she went to the next and the next. After tearing through those, she went into the boys' room and searched their drawers. Aha! She found what she was looking for in a small shaving mirror Ron had left behind, tucked neatly in with his socks. The mirror's surface was a bit dirty, spotted with bits of dried shaving foam from his wand, but perfectly serviceable. Hermione gathered the shaving mirror and tucked it securely in her beaded bag. She needed at least one more for her plan to work, and there was a cute little pocket makeup mirror that Ginny had given her around the time of the Yule Ball. But the plans had to wait. She needed to ward the space around Jaime Lannister's room. The walk from her bedchambers in Riverrun, near the family wing, so to speak, across halls and wings, and down and then back up several staircases, ended when she was on the opposite side of the castle, facing towards the Riverlands and not the mountain view she had from her room. There was a single guard posted outside the Lannisters' bedroom, which she thought strange. She recognized the young man, though, as one of Robb's Kingsguard, and one of Blackwood's sons, Lucas. Hermione eyed him as she slowed her approach, from striding to a gentle walk as she neared the door. Lucas was on the younger side, where Eddard and Torrhen Karstark were both in their early 30s, and Daisy Mormont and Darren Hornwood in their late 20s. Lucas and Robb were closer in age, and their youthful appearance emphasized that Lucas was tall and skinny, with wiry muscle. He had a head full of curly dark brown hair and a square face with dark, round eyes set under a heavy brow. His complexion was darker than some Northmen, a golden hue closer to that of Jaime Lannister and those who lived near the coasts. Unlike most Northmen, Lucas preferred a mild facial trim with scruff on his cheek and under his chin, with some sideburns and the soft bristles of a mustache on his upper lip that oddly suited him well. Hermione had seen him trim anything longer to a more manageable length that would never become bushy. "Lady Hermione," he greeted in a soft voice. Hermione nodded back. "Lucas." She glanced at the door. "Just you, today." He shook his head. "Darren will be back soon, but the Kingslayer hasn't woken." "Has Maester Vyman been by?" asked Hermione, drawing her wand. She began tracing runes of containment and repellent on the doorframe, Lucas watching her with his dark eyes. "Earlier this morning," confirmed Lucas. "What did the man say about Jaime's injury?" asked Hermione curiously. "She's plucked a strand of the man's hair when she was in the room to ward the room on him directly." Lucas shrugged, a very laconic move for the rather solemn man. "He'll live," obviously thought Hermione darkly. It wasn't like they exactly cared about the well-being of their prisoner. There was no Geneva Convention here to dictate terms of POWs. She sighed and entered the room, Lucas watching all the while. Jaime Lannister remained on top of the covers of the bed. He had been deposited on the previous night in the same position. He was still unconscious, but his brows were furrowed and there were tense lines around his mouth and eyes that showed his pain and discomfort. It prickled at Hermione, but first things first, she thought, and she reached out and yanked a single strand of golden hair from his head. The man made no move as she did so. With a few other whispered words of Latin, the strand dissolved into the same golden confetti that she used to scry his location, and the golden specks quickly spread and soon covered the entire interior of the room from floor to ceiling. The golden dust shimmered for a moment and then seeped into the stone walls of the room, into the rough stone floors and wooden beams of the ceiling. The room was warded, and Jaime Lannister could not leave without Hermione's dismantling the spell. She'd build a failsafe in for Robb alone later, a password-protected key for him to come and go as well. Hermione paused by Jaime's bed, peering down at the older man. This was the man that Robb said had pushed his younger brother from a tower, resulting in him being crippled. This was the same man that practiced incest with his own sister, that resulted in 3 children. Both were terrible crimes. By all rights, the man had admitted to them and was even proud of what he had done and would continue to do if free. So why was Hermione defending him? "I suppose it goes back to SPW, of a sort," she thought with a mood of distaste. Well, she certainly didn't consider Jaime Lannister a house elf, and didn't she wish just for a betrayed moment that they existed in Westeros so they could handle the day-to-day of dealing with Jaime Lannister in his warded cell? She likened him more to a Death Eater of Lucius Malfoy or Severus Snape's caliber. Both men, particularly Malfoy, had committed several crimes while she was a student at Hogwarts, not limited to trying to kill Ginny, although it was likely he had no idea what the diary actually was, kill Harry, set a basilisk on the students of Hogwarts, which included his own son, and then participated in 2 major battles, the one in the Department of Mysteries, and later at Hogwarts. And yet, this was a man who attempted to almost beg with Harry to hand over the prophecy. He even had said they would go free. Did she necessarily believe that? Had he been alone with maybe 1 or 2 of the other Death Eaters, ones who had not been in Azkaban, perhaps? But with Bellatrix, both Rodolphus and Rabastan, and then Dolohov with him, there was no way they'd let the 6 of them leave. When the battle resumed after Harry's second resurrection, the man spent more time finding his son and then disappearing than participating, as that was all Lucius and Narcissa had wanted to do upon their arrival at Hogwarts. Find Draco and leave. Could Hermione blame them? What would Molly or Arthur have done if they were losing and they had the opportunity to save one or two of their children? They would have sent Ginny to safety, being their youngest and only daughter, despite her protests. Could Hermione expect any less of the Malfoys? In all honesty, she saw both sides, and while she didn't like them, she would have been able to work side by side. Maybe that was why she could see beyond the obvious with the Kingslayer as well. She was as alien to him as he was to her, and as an outsider, she didn't have the same notions of the man as others did. Maybe it would change, and maybe it would not. Now, though, she would defer to Robb's knowledge of the situation. Jaime Lannister would remain a prisoner in Riverrun for quite a long time. There was no wrapping paper in Westeros, Hermione discovered, after hunting down a few of the Riverrun servants she knew on a first-name basis. Never ignore the staff, she knew their value better than most, as they were the backbone of any household. Instead, she found a clean tissue in her tent and transfigured it into some sparkling silver wrapping paper with prowling wolves in dark gray. It was like they were hunting their prey across a winter landscape. Suitable, and something I think Robb will like, she thought happily, using a sticking charm to seal the edges of the paper together over the mirror. Then she went in search of Robb. There were many people in the hallways of Riverrun, despite being a fairly large castle-cum fortress. The many passages and hallways that branched to different wings and halls, each and every one was filled with people, either brushing and sweeping the floor, lighting candles from hanging chandeliers, or scrubbing. Riverrun had to be gleaming for Robb's 20th name day, which was only 2 days away. Hours-long feasts were planned, so the kitchen was a no-go zone. Even the Great Hall, where most of the lords gathered to share intel and went down after political discussions, was considered off-limits, as in a token of good faith, Catelyn was allowed to organize the celebration under supervision. It kept her busy, and with Arya miserably trailing behind her, kept the Tully woman focused. Hermione still thought that was something psychologically wrong, and that Catelyn needed an impartial friend to sit down and discuss things with, but since therapists and therapy didn't exist in Westeros, it was a problem Hermione shelved for another date. She was also acutely aware that she was sliding into her fixer tendencies. At Hogwarts, Harry had a saving people thing, and had a thing for sticking her nose in other people's business when it wasn't always warranted. That meant that she thought there was a problem and she wanted to fix them. However, since very few meetings were actually called that required Hermione's presence, she figured the best place to find Robb was in one of three options: the lists, practicing with his squire, Olivar, or his men; the tiny and very southern Godswood, or his office, going over paperwork and correspondence. Taking a circuitous route, Hermione quickly eliminated the last two options and found herself on the same balcony, catwalk, overlooking the inner courtyard that was used for training with the training ring. She and Daisy had decimated Hornwood and the Karstarks. Robb himself was being circled by his guard, as well as the Great John and Lord Glover. The two older men were dressed in full chainmail and leathers, but the younger soldiers had shucked much of their heavy armor despite the chilled weather. Their breaths misted in front of their faces, but sweat glistened off their bodies, and their faces were flushed red. And while the men, and even Daisy, had impressively toned and muscular bodies, Hermione was utterly transfixed by only one. Whenever she was with him, Robb was covered from neck to wrist and toe in layered shirts and vests and trousers tucked into calf-high boots, and even sometimes wrapped in a fur-lined cloak of some sort in stark colors. But now, in the training ring, he wore a sleeveless splint mail, cloth-lined black leather vest with various buckles and straps along both his sides, presumably for tightening the vest to fit him. There was a split skirt underneath the armor, like a reverse tuxedo tail for his front, most likely from the cloth undershirt he wore. His trousers were tucked into matching black knee-high boots, long archer's gloves in black buckled and strapped up his arm into forearm braces. The palm of his hands were bare, leaving him able to keep a grip on his sword as he shifted his weight and swung it in an arc towards Darren Hornwood and Torrhen. Hermione's eyes traced his arm muscles as they flexed and shifted. Sparks flew off the ringing steel as the blades caught in a three-way layer, and then Darren twisted his wrist and disengaged his blade with theirs, stepping back just as Torrhen aggressively moved forward, his blade locked with Robb's. Hermione watched as Robb planted his feet in the ground and pushed back against Torrhen, who was taller than him, but Robb was stockier, and shoved. Robb swung down with his blade, but Torrhen parried and then parried again as the sword swung back and forth, clashes that were rhythmic in the clang, clang, clang of each hit. Each hit increased Hermione's anxiety, and she quickly found her hands up at her cheeks, her nails digging in quite like the Triwizard Tournament when Harry went up against the dragon. The young wolf spun away from Torrhen, and then Lucas and Eddard were there, both attacking him at once, causing the young wolf to raise his blade with both hands and block their downswing with his sword parallel to the ground. He quickly stepped back, but then Torrhen and Darren were there, with Daisy prowling around the edges, looking for a way in with her two gladius swords. Robb kicked Darren, sending him stumbling back, bringing his sword up to clash with Torrhen's behind. Eddard let out a cry and charged, bringing his sword down in a stroke that would slice at Robb's back. But the young man broke from Torrhen's blade, slashing sideways and making Hermione's friend and guard weave away from the glinting metal. Robb continued the momentum and spun around to face Eddard, blocking the downward swing. He then rammed forward and pushed Eddard back, knocking him into Lucas, who fell to the floor. Daisy let out a scream and moved with both blades forward. Robb, instead, wove backwards, each step making him move around the ring as Daisy slashed with both. Robb looked like a dancing snake, a cobra listening to some unheard Snake Charmer's music as he ducked, bobbed, slid, and twisted around Daisy's attack, only using his sword to knock away her blade when they got too close. Eddard and Torrhen teamed up their usual set, but it was soon predictable, and Robb was easily keeping up to both men and their familiar attacks. Instead, he allowed them to nearly box him in at one corner of the ring, and then he utilized Hermione's own tactic against them. He climbed onto the partial barrier that surrounded that ring and used the height to bear down on both men. With the high ground, he kicked at Torrhen, snapping the man's head back with a blow to his chin. Torrhen crumpled to the ground like a puppet cut from his strings. Eddard, in rage, turned to renew the fight, but Robb had him pinned, his sword tip at the man's throat. "Yield," he said quietly. Eddard dropped his sword, panting heavily with a glare in his eyes, but stepped away. However, Robb had forgotten about Lord Glover and the Great John. Glover snuck up and swept Robb's legs from the wall. Hermione winced at the loud crack his back made sliding down, and then the Great John was there. No sword in hand, but a single punch sent Robb to the ground, a dazed look on his face. The crowd around them moaned. The Great John let out a booming laugh and helped the woozy king to his feet. Hermione breathed a sigh of relief that Robb was still walking, unsteadily, and brought her hands down to rest on the balustrade. "Ah, your grace," laughed the Great John. "You were so focused on the enemy ahead, you didn't see us at the side." "Something," Robb trailed off, shaking his head. Something I'll strive to remember in the future, Umber." Glover gave Robb a thin-lipped smile of approval. "Not all enemies will come at you from in front, your grace." Robb nodded. "Now, why don't you go clean up, eh?" suggested the Great John, motioning for Olivar Frey to race forward with a towel and goblet filled with something. Handing them both to Robb, "You've got an audience." "An audience?" repeated Robb. The Great John turned his head and looked pointedly at Hermione, high above them, watching. Her face turned bright red at being called out for watching. Both Robb and Glover turned to face her as well. But while Glover's tiny smile slipped off his face into neutrality, Robb's face split into a beaming smile. "My lords," the young king said, pushing past the gangly squire, shoving the towel and drink back at him as he loped across the grounds and over the barrier of the ring, and then up a set of side stairs to Hermione's balcony overlooking the courtyard. "How long were you watching?" he asked breathlessly, coming to a stop, a few feet from her. "Long enough," replied Hermione, wrestling with her heated cheeks. To draw attention away from her embarrassment, she reached into her beaded bag and thrust the wrapped present towards him, despite it being a few days early. "What's this?" he asked, gingerly taking it, running his fingers over the shiny and strange fabric wrapping, eyes wide. "Your birthday present." Hermione closed her eyes. "Cultural differences, Hermione. Sorry, your name day present." Blue eyes lit up in childish wonder. Robb grinned up at Hermione from under his brow, and the look sent a zing of something straight down her spine. He undid the wrapping carefully, and then his brows came together in confusion. "A mirror?" "When it shakes, say my name. My full name, okay?" Hermione smirked at the look. She pulled another de Yule mirror from Ginny and began walking away. "Just stay there." She apparated down into the courtyard and held the mirror at eye level, certain that Robb was watching her from the balcony, although he couldn't hear her. Holding his gaze, she whispered to the mirror, "Robb Stark." On the balcony, Robb jumped and fumbled with the mirror that, although she couldn't hear or see it, would begin vibrating in his hands. There were a few moments until he regained his hold, and then his lips moved. Hermione? Shock covered his voice, and Hermione moved her eyes from the physical man standing above her to the face in the mirror. "Hello, Robb," she said, beginning to move and holding the mirror at eye level so he could see not only her face, but the surroundings. "Do you like your gift?" "But this is a mirror," he sputtered. "How are we talking like this? Is it like your parchment?" "It is, isn't it?" Hermione nodded. "Yes, very similar. We just have to say each other's name, and then the mirror will let you know there is a call coming in. To end the call, you just say the person's name and finite." "This is much more secure than the parchment," said Robb aloud, already thinking of ways to use the mirrors. Hermione turned on her heel and apparated back next to him, and to her surprise and pleasure, he didn't jump at the sharp crack. "Very secure. You can use them anywhere, at any time. It'll be an immediate response, unless the other person doesn't have their mirror." She then pointedly looked at hers and said, "Robb Stark, finite." "Do we just have one set, then?" asked Robb, examining the shaving mirror as it went foggy and dark for a moment until the smoke cleared up and all he saw was his reflection in the polished surface and not Hermione's face. "For now," she admitted, "but I'm going to make one for Arya and then for Sansa. Getting it to her might be difficult. We need to find someone who can pass off as a servant to slip into the Red Keep and leave it for her. Then it'll be easier to plan a way for her to escape and get out. Even better, once I see her room, I can visualize it and apparate to her and portkey back to Riverrun." Robb was speechless. There was a strange look on his face, equally parts surprise, happiness, and something else that reminded her of Fleur's face when she declared herself to be beautiful enough for both her and Bill after being scarred by Greyback. "Hermione," he breathed, a different breathless quality to his voice compared to earlier. He stretched his hand forward and cupped her elbow, drawing her close to him, but not quite enough. There was still a sliver of space between their bodies. There is no way I can repay you for this." "There's nothing to repay," she said quietly, sensing the intimacy of the moment. "You have bled for me, fought in my army, and won the trust of my men," the young king began, his voice low and his eyes dark, a blue-gray that reminded her of a summer storm over the sea. "You returned Arya to me, and now a way for Sansa to come home. You found the Kingslayer and restored peace among my men for my mother's mistake." He shook his head. "What can't you do?" Flustered, Hermione blurted out, "Fly. I'm terrified of heights." There was a momentary silence, and then Robb was leaning back, laughing loudly. His entire body shook, and Hermione's twisted into a wry smile. "Ha ha," she deadpanned. Robb's laughs died off into chuckles. "The witch who can do it all is afraid of heights?" He shook his head. "You'd best not go to the wall, then." "I'll keep that in mind." There was a wide grin on Robb's face, his cheeks flushed from his laughter. "Come, Lady Hermione, I want to show you something." He slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, and it was the most natural thing in the world. They ignored any looks sent their way, knowing looks from the northern men, cautious looks from the Riverlands lords, and hostile looks from the Freys, in general, as Robb led her towards the blacksmith. "Remember that plan about the pins, the designs for all members of their houses under their family sigils?" began Robb. Hermione nodded. "I had Gendry begin work on them," revealed Robb quietly, tilting his head close to Hermione's as they walked. "Arya recommended him, and honestly, I indulged my little sister. But Gendry helped keep her safe when they left King's Landing, so I owe him somewhat. He's earned my trust." The blacksmith was incredibly warm, with the heat radiating from the building several feet away. Hermione could feel it as they walked up to the low stone building, separate from everything else in case of fire. Inside there were several men in various states of dress. Some just wore leather aprons over their chests, while a few others wore tunics that stuck to their bodies with sweat. Gendry, whom Hermione had met before, was working diligently on something, banging away with a hammer before switching to a chisel for more delicate work. On a workbench next to him were finished and polished silver cloak pins. There was a variety of designs, and as they moved closer, Hermione spotted the familiar wolf's head for Stark, the curved fish for Tully, and others. "There has to be at least one for each family that is here," she thought in surprise, glancing at Robb. He caught her eyes and nudged his chin towards the buckets underneath the workbench, some halfway full with the pins. Hermione's eyes grew wide. "I knew Gendry was good. Arya said so and wouldn't exaggerate something like that. But in Ron's words, Bloody hell. Gendry, called Robb loudly. The young man, only a few years younger than Hermione and Robb, startled and his chisel slipped. It didn't damage the metal he was working with, but it was enough for the man to turn, a grumble on his lips, that died quickly when he saw who stood near. He swept into a low bow, eyes down, as he mumbled, "Your Grace." "Gendry, we're gonna borrow one of these, okay?" said Robb, picking the direwolf head from the workbench, and then spiriting her out of the smithy as quickly as they arrived. "What's going on?" asked Hermione, as Robb tugged her forward back into Riverrun. "I want to show you something," he said, eyes forward. "You already said that, and you already did," protested Hermione. "What's next?" Next was in the family wing of Riverrun, specifically his mother's childhood bedroom. The soft, muted colors of blue in varying shades spoke of a softer, different Catelyn who was supposed to marry Brandon Stark and not Eddard. There was a gauzy canopy around her bed, with pale silk pillows and a thin bed sheet and duvet compared to the thick covers Robb, as well as Torrhen, had told her about in the north. There were comfortable chairs and benches lined with padding, half-finished and unfinished needlepoint and embroidery projects littered on side tables and on the walls. The room was light and airy, and its subtle femininity made Hermione wonder if the North hardened Catelyn or if she hardened herself. "Because this isn't completely awkward, Robb," began Hermione, deliberately standing in the middle of the room, with her arms crossed over her stomach, trying not to touch anything. "Is there a reason why we're here?" Robb nodded and pointed to a single small landscape painting. "Remember how you told me you can't apparate to a location without seeing it first?" Hermione slowly nodded. "I need you to memorize this location," explained Robb, motioning for Hermione to come closer. Reluctantly, she did so, eyes on the painting. Robb elaborated further on it without her prompting. "Uncle Brandon had it painted for Mother back when they were courting before the war. It was one of his favorite places to go with Father, and then Father showed John and I one day. Surrounded by unending forest, a single, partially slanted Rapunzel's tower stood alone, a swath of gray in a sea of dark green against the backdrop of steely grays and white. "There's a tower in the Wolf's Wood," said Robb quietly, reverence in his voice. "It's not far from Winterfell, but it's enough that you'd take a day or two to get there on horseback. Father showed it to John and I when we were old enough, and then later we'd go with Jory and the others. The tower doesn't look like that anymore. It's a bit rougher, and it's missing some roof slats, but nothing really changes in the Wolf's Wood." "This is in the north?" asked Hermione, just as quietly. The painting was well done, and she could almost hear the rustling of the leaves in the trees, the low whisper of the wind. Robb nodded. "Robb, normally apparition doesn't work like that," she said, thinking back to the 3Ds. "We usually need reference points, an image that's not a painting, like a memory. But—" "You'll do it?" asked Robb. "You can take me?" Hermione rolled her lower lip in and began to nibble. "I think so. I'm gonna go myself first. Then I'll come back. I don't want to risk a splinch." "Now?" asked Robb, incredulous. "No time like the present," smiled Hermione, and feeling a bit reckless like Harry, she turned on her heel, and instantly Catelyn's childhood bedroom in Riverrun was bitterly cold. A harsh, hissing wind bit into Hermione's thin sweater, and she stood in snow up to her ankles, shivering. Her hair caught and snarled around her. The wind and chill had tears come to her eyes, and Hermione could feel them freeze. But before her, surrounded by a large clearing, was the tower in Catelyn's painting, jutting out with one side completely covered with stuck-on, wet packing snow from the wind. It leaned a bit more to the side than it did in the painting, and there were holes in the roof, but it was still recognizable. Keen to escape the chill, Hermione apparated back to Riverrun. "Gods above, Hermione." Then Robb's hands were on her shoulders, quickly rubbing up and down her arms as her teeth chattering. I wasn't expecting teeth to be teeth that sea cold." "I'm sorry," replied Robb, a frown pulling at his mouth. "I forgot, you wouldn't realize that it's the beginning of winter there." "Beginning of winter?" stammered Hermione incredulously as she looked up at him. "That's almost as much snow as I saw at Hogwarts in the dead of winter. How much worse is it gonna get?" The frown twisted deeper. "We had a long summer. It'll probably be as long as—" "A long summer?" "About a decade or so," replied Robb thoughtfully. Hermione's mouth dropped open. "A decade? Is that unusual?" he asked. Hermione did not reply. Clearing his throat, Robb moved back and ran a hand over his short auburn beard. "Let me grab my winter cloak, and we can go." He stalked off, and Hermione took the opportunity to fish out a thicker coat from her beaded bag, thankful that she was still living day-to-day with it and that she hadn't unpacked. The sight of a floating cloak down the halls of Riverrun, while humorous, would probably scare people more than floating crockery or bottles. Clothing was always different, for some reason. When Robb returned, Hermione smartly pointed her wand at him and then herself, non-verbally casting a warming charm. She sighed happily as the persistent chill that comes with winter eased from her bones. She was as toasty as when she would sink into a warm bath. Robb felt the same way, given the small smile on his lips. That's quite a nifty spell. Can you charm it on things too? Hermione shook her head. I'd rather not. Shall we? She extended her hand, and he took it in his larger palm, sliding against hers and then trapping her fingers as he laced them together, tugging on her slightly. Ready. Robb had never experienced apparition. He heard about it in length from both Torrhen and Dacey, and even Bracken and Blackwood once. He thought the sensation of being pushed through a small opening was an exaggeration by Torrhen, and that Dacey's grumbling about a sick stomach were just her way of expressing her ire towards Hermione. But Robb realized that they were not over-exaggerating, and as for apparition, he didn't care for it at all. When they landed, Robb had to lock his knees to keep from sinking into the snow, and he wheezed heavily, breathing in through his nose and relishing in the sharp chill of winter in the north to settle his stomach. I'm sorry, he heard Hermione say from above him, but I'm told it gets better with time. Torrhen can manage to stay on his feet now, even if he looks a bit green. Replied Robb, struggling. Eventually, he rose to his full height and marveled at being back at the tower in the Wolf's Wood, when seconds before, he was in the Riverlands. He didn't even feel the cold. It was nippy, but like a cool summer's day instead of the biting freeze he was expecting when Hermione came back. Lips already tinged blue and her skin icy pale. Her warming charm was a wonder, and it gave him the opportunity to enjoy the sight of his childhood stomping ground. And even better, the company, he thought, sending a quick sorry to John, wherever his half-brother, or was, standing just an arm's length from him. Hermione had her head tilted back, eyes locked above her as large goose feather like snowflakes tumbled down from puffy gray clouds. The wind was beginning to ease off, so the flakes appeared less of a battery of swirling white to a gentle, steady fall. Her brown hair was speckled with the white flakes, and a thin layer was already covering her shoulders. Then Hermione stuck her tongue out and tried to catch a snowflake. She let out a laugh of pure childish glee, and the next thing he knew, she had yanked on his hand and pulled him forward, their legs trudging as they pushed through the snow. Then she let go and fell back, her body denting the snow pile with a soft whumph. She began spreading her arms and legs, moving them back and forth. What are you doing? Laughed Robb. I'm making a snow angel, she replied, rolling her eyes. What? Don't have those in Westeros? He shook his head at her antics. Hermione held her arms out when she decided she had suitably created the wings and wriggled her fingers at him. Pull me out without disturbing the angel. He rolled his eyes but leaned forward and instead lifted her bodily from the indent she made, crushing her against his chest as he stepped. Their noses brushed against one another, tiny clouds of air escaping their mouths, mingling together as Hermione stared into Robb's eyes. She could feel every line of his body, from her neck to her hips, where she was pressed tightly against him. There was the hard leather of his light armor, the metal buckles and clasps digging into her softer clothes, the firmness of his muscles, the heat that radiated from him, and not just because of the warming charm. I began Robb, eyes darting down from hers to her mouth. Abort! A distant part of Hermione's brain shrieked, He's engaged to a fray? You want to go home? But another, a quiet, insidious part of Hermione whispered, Go on, you know you want us, you've been thinking about it. Instead, logic prevailed, and Hermione cleared her throat, tearing her eyes from Robb, smoothing her hands over his shoulders instead. She patted them and said, You can let me down now. I think my angel survived. All right. Robb let Hermione slide down his body, and she failed to hide the shiver it elicited from her, deciding to keep her eyes firmly averted. She knew she was blushing, and given that she could still feel his body heat, she knew he was still close to her, looking down, watching. So, she began, stepping a bit to the side and then forward, staring up at the tower before she spun around to face him with her hands tightly clenched behind her back. Why did you want to come here? His eyes were fixed on her, the blue a deep, deep sapphire, and for a long moment he was silent. Then he said, "I'm thinking we can use this as a staging ground for the army to retake Winterfell. No one would expect us to come this way. We can use a token force as a distraction to stare down Winterfell through Torrhen's Square, while the majority of the forces come from behind." "And you want to make the pins port keys?" said Hermione, understanding everything instantly. "That will be a lot for me to spell, Robb." He nodded. "I know, I'm not saying tomorrow, or within a fortnight, or even 3 moons from now, but eventually, 6 moons maybe." Determination welled up in Hermione. "I'll do it in 4. "I don't want you being magical exhausted again," he said quietly, but in the still of the quiet Wolfswood, his words were loud. "I won't," argued Hermione. "Haven't you noticed? I've been doing more lately, especially non-verbally. Magic is getting easier for me to use." "If you say so," replied Robb dubiously. After a long moment, much of it spent surveying the tower and the forest, he turned back to her. "Ready to go to Riverrun?" "In a moment," she said, turning to take in the picture-perfect forest and its majestic silence, as well as the snow-covered trees around them. "This reminds me of last winter." "Oh?" "Harry and I, well, we were alone. Ron had left us, and we were stuck in the middle of the Forest of Dean by ourselves near Christmas," she began. "There was snow on the ground, and it was cold, and we were running out of food. We were getting desperate for something to happen. A breakthrough to defeat Voldemort, but nothing was coming. The locket, the Horcrux, kept making things worse too." She deliberately kept her back to Robb, knowing that he hadn't heard this story from her before. She kept notoriously quiet about her past with him. But even so, Torrhen, who knew most, did not know this part. "And then, just when we were at our lowest, She shook her head and gave a tiny laugh. "We just started dancing, Harry and I, in the middle of that tent. Starving, terrified, stupidly young us just looking for a moment of peace. With no music, just us shuffling our feet, taking comfort that our best friend was there when the world was going to hell." "Harry!" She blinked back tears, discreetly rubbing at her nose. Then Robb's hand reached for hers, and he tugged her around to face him. "How?" he asked. "How what?" she replied. He held the hand he was holding up. "How did you dance?" Hermione blinked, but then smiled. "Oh, like this." She positioned one hand of his on her waist, and the other he kept holding. And then, with no music, in the north, just days away from his childhood home, while large fat snowflakes fluttered down around them, they danced in silence in the chill of winter, enjoying the feelings of peace and happiness that rose between them. Hermione had her head tilted up, looking past his scruffy chin, his smirking lips, his long nose, and then to his sparkling eyes, and saw the contentment she felt reflected back to her. It was almost like dancing with Harry, except there was something so undeniably different, something that felt right, that it scared her just the same. Yet, she didn't speak, didn't interrupt their moment. Reality would intrude the moment they returned to Riverrun. And it did, as the day after Robb's 20th, his grandfather, Hoster Tully, breathed his last. Hoster Tully's funeral was very similar, and very different to Albus Dumbledore's. There was no phoenix singing a lament for the fallen man, nor did Rufus Scrimgeour show up to make a speech on behalf of the Ministry of Magic, and Hermione wasn't sitting next to Ron, clutching his hand with the terrifying realization that any day now she, Ron, and Harry would begin their plan to disappear and hunt Voldemort's Horcruxes. But the man lay covered, a shroud, in Tully blue, with an embroidered silver trout sigil obscuring the man's wasted body from view, with his sword weighing the shroud down. He lay on top of a large pyre that had been built upon a floating pontoon of some sort, which would be pushed out onto the Trident for a water-based, Viking-like burial. Hermione stood behind the Tully family on the deck that extended partially into the Trident, Torrhen and Daisy behind her, but acting as her continued guard, much to Daisy's disgust. Brendan and Catelyn stood just ahead of her and off to one side, while Edmure held a longbow. Robb stood stoically beside his mother, while Arya fidgeted, her hands constantly grabbing at the dress she was forced into. Grey Wind, ever loyal to his master, was at Robb's side. Around them, Tully soldiers stood as silent and motionless sentinels, several acting as flag-bearers. A gentle breeze made the Tully sigil flutter in a meager, chilly wind. Behind them, along the shore, was a token amount of people, ranging from the Castellan of Riverrun to Maester Wyman, and many others whom Hoster Tully interacted with on a daily basis. All were silent as Wyman led a prayer for the stranger. The religion of the South, the Faith of the Seven, which Hermione learned was based on 7 figures who represented aspects of life, was incredibly different to what Turin had described the North's religion to be like. Fewer figures, more prayers, more communal. Hermione, who had grown up Church of England, found the faith similar and different enough that it still felt familiar, even with the burning pyre on the water. Once the prayer was done, Brynden and Robb walked off the pier and down a few steps that led into the cold waters of the Trident to where 2 Tully soldiers were holding on to the pontoon to keep it from floating away. The Blackfish and Robb then took control of the pontoon from the 2 soldiers as Hoster's family. They gently pushed, and Hermione watched as the funeral boat slowly floated downstream. At the same time, Edmure, as Hoster's heir, stepped forward, drawing an arrow from his side, quiver. A brazier nearby was lit by a soldier, and Edmure waited a few tense minutes until the pontoon was further downstream and then dipped the arrow into the brazier. Once the fire caught on the tip, he knocked the arrow and drew back, glancing at the wind direction. He paused, judging the distance, and drew in a deep breath. As he exhaled, he released the string to the bow, and the arrow went flying, cutting through the air quickly and landing on the funeral boat, catching the dried twigs that surrounded the man. Almost instantly, the spark grew as the flames raced along the edges of the man's body first, before slowly licking the shroud and engulfing the rest of the pyre. Catelyn made a tiny noise as the flames began to grow. Hermione watched as Arya glanced up at her, alarm on her face. On the woman's other side, Robb, too, glanced over, but it was Brynden who spoke. After 30 years of fighting, I think he'd forgotten what started it. Catelyn, distracted, turned to face her uncle. I beg your pardon. Brynden shook his head, his graying hair a tangle in the wind. Hoster, my brother, he asked me to stop calling myself Blackfish, said it was an old joke, and it was never funny to begin with. There was silence as Edmure returned from where he stood at the edge of the pier to join the family in the line. Gray Wind huffed. No one knew what to say to Catelyn to ease her pain at losing her father. Hermione, realizing what he was doing, took a tiny half-shuffle forward and nudged into Robb's back. Startled, he glanced at her, but she jerked her head a few times in his mother's direction. His eyes were wide, and he glanced from her to his mother, panic on his face. In response, Hermione inaudibly sighed and rolled her hand in a loose go-on motion, looking between his mother and Brynden, hoping he caught on before the silence became too awkward. Apparently he did, because Robb's eyes grew round and he nodded, clearing his throat and loudly asking his great-uncle, "What did grandfather say to that, uncle?" Brynden flashed Robb a grim smile, partially in thanks for continuing the conversation topic and for drawing Catelyn's attention back to the story of her father. Well, I told Hoster, people have been calling me Blackfish for so long, I don't remember my real name, he chortled, although it was slightly forced. But it worked. Catelyn had a small smile on her face, although it was bittersweet. Every time he left for the capital or to fight in a campaign, I'd see him off. Wait for me, little cat, he'd say. Wait for me, and I'll come back to you. And I would sit at this window every day when the sun came up, waiting. Her face crumpled. I'll be waiting for a long time now. Both father and Ned. Brynden was at his niece's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as Catelyn cried. This was what we were waiting for, thought Hermione, with a mental sigh. Catelyn probably didn't have time to mourn her husband since the news that he had been executed in King's Landing, moving from one campaign to another with leading Robb and making their way to Riverrun. Maybe now she can begin to heal, especially knowing her children are all alive and well. Brynden and Catelyn leaving were the beginning of the exodus of others on the shore, all quietly returning to the castle where Edmure was now Lord of Riverrun and Lord Paramount of the Trident. The man in question made his way to his best friend Mark Piper, as well as Bracken, Blackwood, Carol Vance, and Jason Mollister, all who were with him during the Battle of the Trident. Robb stepped up to Hermione with Arya at his side, Grey Wind's tail swishing as they began to move. Robb's face was a bit pale, the effects of a hangover from his name day celebrations, that merged with grief for a man he didn't really know, and the grief for what his mother was going through, as well as stress from the war. Thank you for that, he murmured to her. Hermione gave a tiny shrug. I think it was long overdue. She then looked at Robb from the corner of her eyes and in a tiny voice suggested, maybe Brienne of Tarth would be a good companion for your mother to speak to. Robb's mouth turned down. She's a prisoner for helping the Kingslayer escape under my mother's orders. You think putting her and my mother together in a room is a good idea? Well, when you put it that way, thought Hermione with a sarcastic tinge to her mental voice. I like Brienne, said Arya suddenly, causing both Robb and Hermione to look at the young girl, who had been surprisingly silent. She was next to Grey Wind, walking beside him with her hand running through his fur with an occasional scratch around his neck. How do you know of Brienne? Asked Robb incredulously. Arya shrugged, looking down at her nails. Arya, warned Robb. Finally, the dark-haired girl looked up. She goes for walks with her guards, and she often stops by the lists. When Mother doesn't need me, I'm down there too. I want to fight. Father had a dancing master for me in King's Landing. Robb's mouth dropped open and then snapped shut. His eyes cast about, looking for help and finding it in Hermione, who had her face slightly turned away, stifling a laugh. Arya was on a roll, still listening to things she wanted to do but couldn't, and I want to see what the men are doing. Someone can teach me to fight, like you and Hermione, like Daisy. That way I won't have to help Mother with stupid stuff, like embroidery and needlepoint. I don't want to wear dresses and be like stupid Sansa. Well, I'm sure Daisy would prefer your company over mine, Arya, said Hermione eventually, fighting to keep a smile from her face. A soft snort from behind her, where Daisy and Torrin walked as guards, confirmed this. And Sansa isn't stupid, said Robb, but at Arya's disbelieving look, he amended, she just likes and believes in different things. She's still our sister. A disgruntled expression settled on Arya's long face. I suppose. Speaking of Sansa, said Hermione, steering the conversation away from something personal. You know mirror I gave you, Robb? I have one for her as well. And you, Arya. The disgruntled expression slid into confused disgust. What would I want with a mirror? Brilliant, crowed Robb, a bit too loudly as those ahead of them from the funeral glanced back, forcing him to lower his voice. But how are we going to get it to her? I still think the plan of sneaking someone into King's Landing as staff is the best option, said Hermione. People rarely look at those working. I'll find someone, said Robb with a solid, firm nod. Why is this mirror so important? Cried an impatient Arya, whose head had been bouncing between the two. Robb turned towards his youngest sister. You've seen the communication parchment Hermione made, right? When she nodded, he continued. The mirror is the same, but you can actually see the person you're speaking to, as though they are in front of you. Arya's eyes grew wide and turned silently to Hermione, who pulled out a small, unadorned mirror in the shape of a small pocket watch from her universe. She had gone to Gendry to commission it earlier when she finished the Stark bucket of pins. She was now working her way through the Tully bucket as those had been completed first by the talented blacksmith. The mirror itself was simple, round, and compact. There was little design on it for a girl who cared little of frivolity, but there was the direwolf of the Starks on the inside top, and the outside had a long, thin sword, which Gendry mumbled about a needle, as well as 2 horns, or antlers, which he said was a bit of a creator's mark for him. Arya took the small mirror with trembling hands, clicking it open and gapping at her reflection in the transfigured glass. Hermione placed inside. She had cast the spells, non-verbally, as just the thought of what she wanted to do was enough for the spells to take hold. Her wordless casting was becoming stronger. Just say the full name of the person you want to speak to, instructed Hermione. If you wish to speak to Robb, just say Robb Stark, and his mirror would let him know one of his siblings wanted to speak to him. When you're done your conversation, say finite. All of us will have one, asked Arya, slightly breathlessly, her gray eyes round. Hermione nodded. Just you and Robb for now. And me, I suppose. Arya launched herself at Hermione, across from Robb, and causing him to stumble back a bit on his heels. The girl's tiny, bony arms wrapped around Hermione's waist, and she squeezed tightly. Thank you, she mumbled into Hermione's jacket. When she pulled back from Hermione, Robb glanced over and watched as Arya ran her fingers over the top of the mirror, over the thin sword and antlers. He frowned at the very not Stark-like face. Who made this for Arya? Or did you use your magic? No, I asked Gendry to make it, replied Hermione. He said the antlers were a mark of his. Arya nodded. When we first met, he was told by his blacksmith master to join the Black, because he had no use for him anymore. Gendry had a bull's head helm that he had made and his master allowed him to take it with him. Some of the other boys wanted it, but Gendry is bigger than them and they didn't ask again. When we were attacked, and Yoren died, I took the helm and put it with another boy who died. Landman said that was Gendry because the gold cloaks were after him. You saved his life, said Robb quietly, looking at his sister a bit differently. Then he muttered to himself, why did they want Gendry? Arya, who hadn't heard him, nodded enthusiastically. He's big and strong, and he isn't stupid. But I call him stupid. He misses the obvious. The pins he's making for everyone are very nice, commented Hermione, who had seen many of them up close at this point. She still had several buckets to work her way through, and Gendry was working almost constantly to fill Robb's order. But with an army of 22,000 and over 8 northern houses with individual sigils, plus another 10 or so Riverlands houses and their sigils, it was a lot for the blacksmith to do on his own. How are they coming along? Asked Robb, and something in his voice had Hermione thinking he was switching from Robb Stark to King Robb. She answered accordingly. Slowly but steadily. He started with the largest orders first, such as the Starks, Boltons, and Manderleys. He's almost done with those, and then we'll be working on the next. Good, are we still on schedule then? Hermione frowned. It depends when you want things done, I suppose. At this rate, he'll be done in a few months. Sorry, moons. But if he had some help, they'd be done sooner. I can only cast the Portkey charm on them so many times. Anyway, Arya was watching them curiously. What are you spelling them for? What's a Portkey? Nothing you will need to worry about, said Robb with a grin on his face. And since when do you notice when boys are big and strong, Arya? And for him to not be stupid, what a compliment from you. Arya's face went red, and she punched Robb in the side. Hard. He expelled a breath of air with a loud oof, just as Arya mumbled, who's being stupid now? Asking Brienne to guard and be friends with. Catelyn worked out. Brienne was feeling useless, and suitably guilty for her role of releasing Jaime Lannister, but it was warred with her loyalty to Catelyn and what the woman had asked of her. Eventually, after Hoster Tully's funeral, Robb made the time to sit down with Brienne and thoroughly question her with Bolton, Umber, Karstark, and Maegage with him. This included telling her of his siblings' current locations and the damage his mother had unintentionally caused. Bran ended up being considered harmless, as much as a superior swordswoman could be considered harmless, and employed by Robb to be Catelyn's guard, although the role consisted of also being, at its most basic, a spy in case Catelyn did anything similar to letting the Kingslayer go again, to being a friendly ear when she needed it. Hermione had seen Bran around the castle, a tall, silent shadow walking at Catelyn's side or just behind her, her sharp eyes taking in much of the goings-on of Riverrun, learning her new place in the Northern Army. Do you know what she and Jaime did their few months on the run? Hermione had asked Robb one evening via the enchanted mirror. She was in her tent, charming a bucket of pins, now on the Karstarks, while Robb was up late in his study, going over correspondence. Some of it, but the rest, she said, was personal in nature, replied Robb, his voice coming from a small distance as he had the mirror propped against an unlit candle. Hermione had hesitated. I heard some when I was scrying. I think she loved Renly Baratheon. Robb shrugged, the darkness of the room casting shadows all over his face. His beard and the shadows made him appear older than he was. It wouldn't surprise me. Many people thought Renly handsome, but, well, there were rumors. I heard Jaime Lannister implied it too. They fell silent. Then, I'm glad you let her stay. Your mother needs a friend that Edmure can't be for her. And Brienne needed purpose again. Robb sighed, but gave Hermione a small, tired smile. At some point a week later, from when they brought him back, Jaime Lannister had woken from his fever, utterly horrified by the stump of his right hand and the loss of his sword hand. Hermione had only seen him once more. The man's guards in the room used their swords to push food on a tray through the wards, leaving the once shining golden-haired man tarnished and battered. The man had ignored Hermione's presence the entire time, his head turned away and looking out his window as he sat up on the bed, his arm with the stump thrown as far from his body as he could do so. Hermione left some potions to speed up his healing, as well as a warm meal. When she did eventually return to the room the next day, the potion bottles were empty, the meal was consumed, and the Kingslayer was asleep. And in a strange way, Hermione's heart ached for the man. She did not have time to dwell on it, though. Time slipped from her as her days repeated. Wake up, eat breakfast in the Great Hall with the others, and spend the morning in the library at Riverrun studying what mentions of magic they had or Vyman found for her. After taking diligent notes, she would have lunch delivered to her room, and then she would change and meet Torrhen and Daisy for physical training, with Daisy showing her hand-to-hand combat, and Torrhen would work with her to use her magic alongside his sword. After 2 hours of that, she would return to her tent, shower, and then join Robb in his war room with others he'd invite in specifically for whatever session he was hosting. They would discuss his plans for returning north, for finding Bran and Rickon, and for the next war on the Ironborn, once they were back on their lands. Then it would be a very late dinner in the war room. Depending on who was with them that afternoon, usually Karstark, Bolton, Umber, and Bracken, and Blackwood, the lords would make their excuses and eat elsewhere, leaving Hermione and Robb alone. There, they would discuss anything and everything that came to mind. But that afternoon, 2 months after Hoster Tully's passing and Edmure's transition to Lord Tully and Lord Paramount of the Trident, Robb had called a full meeting of all the Northern and Riverlands lords, as Hermione wanted to present her idea to keep the Lannisters from retaliating on the Riverlands once the large Northern army returned home. "So what is this grand plan that Lady Hermione has for us?" asked Great John Umber, his arms crossed. The war room was full. Everyone representing their house was there, seated around the long rectangular table, looking towards Robb at its head, the fireplace lit behind him. Some had goblets of ale next to their hands, and a few others, such as the young Lyman Derry, had a plate of finger food. "We'll wait for her to begin," said Robb firmly, standing at the head before he turned partially to watch the flames. Grey Wolf lounged in front of the fire, but his ears were perked and his eyes were watchful as more people streamed into the room until there was a gentle lull of soft murmurs and voices with the occasional burst of conversation. Olivar approached Robb, offering him a cup of ale, which Robb indicated at the table, and then the door opened once more, and Hermione slinked in, her hair bushier than normal, a feverish look in her eyes that was triumphant, and a heavy tome in her arms. Robb felt his stomach tighten at the sight of her, and he quickly turned and sat in his chair, which prompted his lords to do the same, their personal conversations cutting off as they realized he was ready to begin. Hermione eased into the seat at Robb's right, placing the book on the table with a muffled thump. Emperor's eyes cut to his king, and seemed to say, "Well, now that we're here," so Robb cleared his throat. "As you know, I have spent some time discussing how the Northern Army will return to the north, while leaving the Riverlands protected and without fear of Lannister retribution." There were some shifts and low murmurs, but no one spoke up. "I asked Lady Hermione to look into this several moons ago, and recently she came up with a solution that I think will work for us going forward," he finished, turning to Hermione, who then stood from her seat. Immediately, close to 40 eyes fell on her, and she fought the urge to squirm. Was this how Harry always felt? Eyes on him? She grimaced and busied herself with tapping her wand on the book so it opened to the right page. She summoned a map of the Riverlands and the surrounding area, laying it on the table, and then dug out some rocks from her pocket to scatter on the table. A nonverbal spell had them rearrange themselves into a miniature of Harrenhal where the castle once sat on the map. "Right, so," she cleared her throat nervously, glancing at Robb, who smiled at her in warm approval. Heat filled her, and she felt herself relax just a smidge. Looking back around the table, Hermione let her voice carry so everyone, even those at the furthest end, like Black Walder, Galbert Glover, and Ronald Vance. "As you all know, several moons ago, King Robb asked Lord Bolton and I to rescue his sister, Princess Arya, from Harrenhal," said Hermione, hating the use of formal titles for people she was familiar with. There were nods around the table, though, so she continued, using her wand to mimic the destruction of Harrenhal. The miniature broke apart, pieces landing here or there, silently on the table. A few lords were leaning forward to watch. "The pieces of Harrenhal are scattered. The destruction of the castle was meant as a deterrent from others using the strategic location and a staging ground for future attacks on the Riverlands and further north," explained Hermione. "But this does not stop Lannisters, or Tyrells, or Martells, or anyone else from just walking up." "What are you suggesting then, Lady Hermione?" asked Lord Karstark, his tone polite but with a tinge of impatience. Hermione waved her wand, and the largest pieces of the Harrenhal miniature rose and then began to spread out, forming a line along the border of the Riverlands and the Lannister Westerlands, the Vale of Arryn, and the southerly Crown Lands under Lannister Baratheon control. The line was impressive, stretching in a vague U-shape, scooped with an opening at the top where the neck was. "A warded line of defense," said Hermione. "Each stone will be infused with the blood of your houses, and each stone will be transfigured into a watchtower, linked together with a barrier that will keep anyone from crossing over into the Riverlands. The only entrance will be through each tower, constantly manned by representatives from that house." And if the tower is stormed by our enemies or destroyed, asked Glover, a tight frown on his face from the far end of the table. The wards I've selected for this will be charmed alongside spells such as the Impervious, Muggle Repellent, and Fire Resistance, said Hermione, turning to Glover directly. They could launch a constant bombardment of flaming projectiles from a trebuchet, and it would do nothing but shake the tower. There were murmurs of surprise along the table, running up and down at her announcement. Explain these wards some more, ordered Umber loudly, eyes focused on Hermione. Have you used them before? She flushed, fidgeting a bit. Well, not really. She looked up at the ceiling. They're kind of, illegal in my world. Illegal? Echoed Mark Piper, Edmur's closest friend. He was a similar age, just slightly older than her, and Robb, with an easy, charming grin and strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes over a lightly freckled face. What does that mean? Where I'm from, spells like this are considered illegal, explained Hermione in a detached, clinical way. The government regulates who practices what kinds of spells to protect its people from potential backlash. At that, Bolton frowned. What kind of backlash? How dangerous is this for you to cast? Oh, it's not really dangerous, per se, replied Hermione with a tiny shrug. Because of the use of blood to personalize the wards, it's considered dark arts, but since I'm not using the magic to control anyone, this just allows your descendants access to the watchtowers as well. You control who can come through your specific tower freely. I'll link the tower to a parchment like our communication ones, and you write the name of everyone who has access in and out of your tower. If you don't want them to have access anymore, you cross their name out. That's fairly simple, said a stupefied Manderley, his jovial Santa Claus features strangely solemn. He ran a hand down his white beard. And this is connected through our blood?
Hermione nodded. Inside each tower, I can make the space as small or large as you want, as comfortable as you want. Bedchambers, kitchen, a hall to eat in, an armory. The inside can be whatever you want while the outside remains the same.
Karstark started laughing, like your tent. Houses Woad and Derry are on the King's Road, explained Hermione, turning two of the stones into small towers. They'd be in control of any trade coming further north, so they need larger amounts of people to vet who comes and goes through their gates. Moodin and Hawick are on the Trident where the river runs out to the ocean. They need a bit more extravagant towers to cover the width of the river. Like the twins? Asked Black Walder darkly. With a scowl, we already have 2 towers that span the Trident. We don't need more. This just ensures that boats don't sneak past the wards, said Hermione evenly, not letting her distaste for the fray show. It's not like the Freys have the proprietary rights to a double tower spanning a waterway. Infusing the stones on the table to turn into towers as she said their names, lighting up to highlight their position on the table, Hermione continued. Heading westward towards the Westerlands, we have Woad at the King's Road, and then what was once seat Harrenhal, Goodbrook, Smallwood, Lord Ronald Vance's seat, and then we finish with Lord Piper by the Westerlands. Then we swing north along the mountains with Wayne, Ryger, and Grell. Everyone's eyes watched as the rocks morphed into towers and they lit up, a flameless version of beacons being lit, outlining the border. They were all now looking at the western edge of the map along the coast by Iron Man's Bay near the pipe. Lord Blackwood, Lord Mallister, and Lord Ehrenford make up the western coast defense, continued Hermione. Then we're in the neck, which is all marsh, and into northern territory. These defenses can be added to the north as well, much later, to help those at Flint's Fingers and those by Blazewater Bay. Back along the King's Road, holding the eastern border would be Shawnee, north of the Derry main tower. Across the map, one rock twisted and rose into a new tower. Followed north with House Hay and then with Viprin. The space in between each of the towers would be warded, an invisible barrier that will stop any humans from crossing it. I wouldn't do the same for any animals, though. You still want grazing and bird migration to happen. This is quite impressive, Lady Hermione, began Admure. But what of those houses, like Tully and Bracken, Leicester, Root, and Lord Carol Vance, who are further inland from these borders? Hermione nodded, having thought of that. You'll strengthen the spaces between the towers. I'll add smaller stones, especially between the larger distances of towers, for power boosts, so to speak. She directed smaller stones with her magic to large gaps between Mooton and Woad, Piper and Ryger, Blackwood and Mollister and Hay, and shiny. As she finished, with all the towers emitting a soft glow, a connected line appeared between them and flared upwards toward the ceiling. A visible, sparking silver barrier linked all the houses together along the watchtowers, encasing the U-shaped border and securing the riverlands from anything south. "But how long will this last?" asked a plaintive Goodbrook, who would be on the highly defensible line of incoming Lannister forces. "As long as you need it," replied Hermione, pitching her voice so everyone heard. "Consider it like a blood sacrifice. As long as the head of your house, or the next heir, constantly add their blood, say once a year, then the protections will last. If you fail to do so, that area of the border will eventually weaken and dissipate." There were grumblings now. "Blood sacrifice, that's a heathen practice. Good southern men don't worship the old ways." Robb stood. "You'll have to, if you want a free defense." The room fell silent. "Lady Hermione does not have to do this. She can leave us to patrol a length border on 3 sides. Her spell and protections will do this for us, leaving only a small tower to be manned with however many men you prefer. The communication parchments between the towers will keep us all informed of what movement there is, or whether you are being attacked. There will be a choke point for any invading forces, which will be defensible from our end. Will you willingly throw this away because of a little blood?" The men at the table began to mutter to themselves, and quickly, the room descended into loud discussions and shouted questions. Some immediately agreed, like Bracken and Blackwood, as well as Lyme and Derry, who didn't have the men to patrol a large area to begin with. Others were more hesitant, unsure of her magic. The discussion lasted long into the night, with Robb championing her spell, as well as Hermione's friends and supporters among the Riverlands lords, and the northern lords sitting in on the discussion. Slowly, one by one, the other houses came on board, agreeing until all that was left was Walder Frey. An unexpected benefit of having the wards go up was that any Lannister men left within when the ward went up would not be able to leave the border unless they went north into the neck, and that included the Mountain and his men, whom everyone wanted dead. With that, Frey, the last holdout to the plan, finally agreed with a long-suffering sigh. Blood was collected and labeled immediately by those who could provide, and plans were made to begin the defense. Hermione would have to sacrifice her research mornings to operate to Harrenhal as a starting point for the towers, and she would have to work quickly so that any Lannister scouts didn't report back what was happening in the Riverlands. "It's late," announced Robb, eventually, casting a glance around the room. Lyman Derry had fallen asleep several hours earlier, slouched in his chair, and many, including him, were stifling yawns. "We'll continue our agenda at a later time." Slowly, everyone began to file out of the room, until only him and Hermione, eyes tired and dry, and her voice scratchy from constantly speaking. "Thank you," he said quietly, as the fire already low crackled and popped behind him. The dying fire cast dark shadows in the room, giving it an intimate, closed feeling. Hermione looked up from the table, where she's sliding the book forward to place in her beaded bag. "For your solution," clarified Robb, facing her and stopping her movements with a hand on her arm, "this gives me a way to return to Winterfell without losing their support. I can remain king in the north and the Riverlands because of you." "You say that now, but talk to me when I actually get this complete," she complained, but a smile belayed her words. "It will work, though. It'll just take me 2 weeks or so from start to finish." "Will you be safe?" asked Robb, peering intently at her. Hermione frowned. "Safe how? From Lannisters. I can have Torrhen come with me, you know? And anyone else you assign." She finished with an eye roll. Robb shook his head. "No, I mean, your magic. Will it be safe? You won't hurt yourself?" "Oh, you mean overextend my magic." Hermione shook her head. "It'll be fine, I'll take proper breaks. If I'm only working in the mornings, it won't harm me." Robb's face remained skeptical. "I promise," emphasized Hermione with a grin. "Very well," sighed Robb. He glanced at Grey Wind, whose jaw stretched wide as he yawned, but slowly lumbered to his feet. "May I escort you back to your room, Lady Hermione?" Hermione felt a blush spread across her cheeks, but she tucked her hand into Robb's elbow and grinned. "You may." They left the room. Outside, Riverrun was quiet, much of the castle sleeping. Some servants still scurried about, and a guard here or there nodded respectfully to their king, but otherwise, the only noise was Grey Wind's nails scratching the stone under his paws. "Now, Lady Hermione," said Robb, a gleam in his blue eyes, "tell me about this idea of a peace summit." Then Hermione's laugh broke the silence, and a smile spread across Robb's face. Sansa wasn't sure why she had been summoned to the small council. It wasn't like a traitor's daughter or a traitor's sister was worth much in King's Landing these days. But she followed behind Ser Meryn, keeping her head down and her eyes forward as she focused on the heels of his armored boots and the flapping edge of his white cloak as they walked the halls from her bedchambers to wherever he was taking her. Eventually, he stopped before a door. "You're to go in here," he said gruffly, an unpleasant look on his face. Sansa's own blue eyes darted up and then down quickly. She threw her shoulders back and tilted her chin up for a moment and stepped through the door. As soon as she did so, she quickly assessed the room. It was a small, intimate, but large enough for a table, chairs, and several seats of various heights and cushions. Not the small council, then, she thought, as there was a not-so-spirited but enthusiastic conversation occurring that she walked right into, ranging between Joffrey, Tyrion, Cersei, all in various shades of Lannister gold or red. Their father, Tywin, with a new black leather eye patch in the middle of a vivid red line that ran vertically up from his cheekbone to his forehead, and Lord Varys in his bright yellow robes, hands tucked into the voluminous sleeves. Joffrey, resplendent in a bright shiny gold tunic over black trousers, was deeply scowling at Varys from his chair in what he probably thought was an indolent sprawl, Fterster of Whisperers. "You're supposed to know everything." The short, bald spy cleared his throat and said solemnly, "No man can be in all rooms at all times. I have many little birds in the Riverlands, my lord, but I don't hear any songs from Riverrun." Joffrey slammed a hand down on the arm of his chair, making Sansa wince. "The Stark forces are distracted. Now is the time to strike." There was a loud scoff, and Sansa's eyes moved from Joffrey, whom she watched like a hawk at all times, to gauge his moods, to see the impliant Tyrion Lannister play with his goblet full of wine, swirling it around. Behind him, his manservant, a scruffy sellsword named Bronn, rolled his eyes. "To strike?" questioned Tyrion, his voice lilting and rolling with a sardonic cant. "My dear nephew, you do see the men preparing the walls for siege. You do understand Stannis Baratheon sails this way." "Stannis?" wondered Sansa, eyes growing wide. "He is on his way to King's Landing? To besiege it?" "If my Uncle Stannis lands on the shores of King's Landing, I'll ride out to greet him," declared Joffrey, sounding petulant and arrogant at the same time. Tyrion didn't bother hiding his disdain at his nephew's words. "A brave choice, your grace. I'm sure your men will line up behind you." "Like anyone would follow you," broke in Cersei nastily, glaring at her brother. Tyrion merely toasted her with his goblet. Paying neither of them attention, Joffrey mused aloud, his voice soft in the room as he gazed dreamily in the distance. "They say Stannis never smiles. I'll give him a red smile, from ear to ear. We'll see how he can burn our temples, and my subjects then." "Oh, for the Seven's sake," muttered Tyrion, who Sansa stood nearest to and was therefore able to hear, as he spoke to Bronn. "The Lord of Light wants his enemies burned. The drowned god wants them drowned. Why are all the gods such vicious cunts? Where is the god of tits and wine?" Apparently it wasn't quiet enough, because Varys spoke up from where he was frowning at the others in the room. "In the Summer Isles, they worship a fertility goddess with 16 teats." Shock overrode Tyrion's face, and then he widely grinned, placing his goblet down firmly on the tabletop. "We should sail there immediately." "Enough!" snapped Tywin, speaking for the first time since Sansa entered the room. "We will not speak of this yet. There are other things to focus on before Stannis' fleet arrives. Tyrion, send your man away." Tyrion waved Bronn goodbye, and the man silently left, although Sansa was sure he was going to remain just outside the door, picking at the dirt under his nails. With a trusty dagger he carried around, even in the Red Keep, Cersei's mouth pulled down into a deep frown as she looked around those who remained in the room, her cool eyes lingering on Tyrion and Sansa. "What you doing here?" the woman said, her honeyed tones barely hiding her disdain for Sansa. Tywin's mouth pulled down in a manner identical to hers. Sansa fought her growing hysteria and desperately focused on not laughing at the eerily similar faces the two were making. "Our business concerns her as well." He turned to Sansa, ordering, "Sit." Sansa moved to the free chair beside Tyrion, who gallantly rose from his seat and helped pull hers back for her, despite barely reaching halfway up the back of the chair. She gingerly sat on the edge, hands folded in her lap and her back rammered straight. Thank you, my lord, she murmured to the nicest of the Lannisters. Tyrion nodded and resumed his seat, busying himself with his wine just as Tywin began speaking. We have something important to discuss, the man said, his voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. It seems, Tyrion, that your new friends, the Tyrells, are plotting to marry Lady Sansa to Sir Loras. Sansa's heart stopped. How did they find out? How did they know? Her entire being froze, and she was certain that her head would soon grace the same pike that her fathers once rested on. At her side, Sansa saw Tyrion glance at her over the rim of his goblet, and then say carefully, the frown on Tywin's face deepened at the lack of anything else from his youngest son, so he turned his eyes on Sansa. She did her best not to squirm under the cold, icy glare. Do you have anything to add or say about this, Lady Sansa? Sansa's folded hands trembled in her lap, so she clenched them tightly, glad that no one could see them under the table, except for Tyrion, whose face went carefully blank, his eyes watchful. She cleared her throat and chirped, hoping her voice didn't tremble. No, my lord, I had no idea. Joffrey laughed loudly. She never does. Silence, snapped Tywin, his head snapping around to face his grandson. He then brought a hand up and traced the edge of his new eye patch. Sansa had heard rumors of how it happened. At Harrenhal, as he and the Mountain escaped from her brother's forces under Roose Bolton's command, something about magic and a witch, but she didn't believe that. Instead, the head of the Lannister family began muttering to himself. I bring them into the royal fold, and this is how they repay me, by trying to steal the key to the north out from under me. Is he going insane? Wondered Sansa momentarily, shocked at the change in the man, and very, very frightened. She had already seen cruelty and madness in Joffrey and Cersei's eyes. It was clear it was a family trait beyond the rumors of Joffrey's parentage. Tyrion frowned, his eyes rooted on his father. Carefully, he said, Lady Sansa is the key to the north. I seem to remember she has an older brother, and rumors of a witch that does his bidding. Tywin twitched. A witch, my lord, began Daenerys, only for Tywin to cut him off, ignoring the spy master entirely. The young wolf's days are numbered, the old man said firmly, his remaining eye focusing on Tyrion alone. There are plans in place to counter these ridiculous rumors. Besides, if the pup plans to return to Winterfell, which all accounts are saying, then he will lose half his army through the desertion of the Riverlords. Further, Theon Greyjoy murdered both his brothers, and the youngest female whelp cannot inherit. That makes Lady Sansa here the heir to Winterfell. As for the witch, Tyrion quickly interjected as well, shaking his head. There's no such thing. She's some kind of woods witch. If anything, useless. Magic exists, my lord. Magic is dangerous, and clever and strong, and can take the shape of anything, said Varys, sounding the most emotional Sansa had ever heard. Although she wasn't around the man that often, she did know that he maintained a certain facade that most of the time projected serenity. It can warp the mind, dull our senses, and kill us all. I know this. That is enough, Spider, said Tywin, his voice frigid. Your paranoia and hysteria will not help. Now, with Lady Sansa reassuring us of her thoughts on the Tyrells, we can issue a refusal as her guardian. The Tyrell army is helping us to win this war, said Tyrion, eyes narrowed, a vague, panicked tone to his voice. Do you really think it's wise to refuse them? There's nothing to refuse. The Tyrells have no say over Lady Sansa. She was set to marry Joffrey before this unpleasantness with her father and brother began. There was a downward turn of Tyrion's mouth, and as such, we can see to her care and well-being. Instead of waiting until after Joffrey's wedding, we will act first. There was silence, and then Tyrion asked, and how do we do that? We find Lady Sansa a different husband, one that best fits her status, and will care for her, will watch over her, announced Tywin to a suddenly silent and chilly room. Sansa felt her stomach roll, and she did her best to keep nausea from appearing on her face at the thought of the Lannisters picking her future husband. There would be no knights, no gallant figures on horseback coming to save her if they had anything to say. Wonderful, said Tyrion, mostly forced joviality in his voice, although there was something brittle to it that made Sansa wonder if he too could feel the foreboding chill of what was to come. Cersei's grin was shark-like. Yes, it is. Sansa's heart sank, and Tyrion, at her side, turned his head from Cersei to Tywin, his eyes growing wider as his mouth dropped open in realization. Tywin nodded at him once. You can't mean it, protested Tyrion, slamming his goblet down and then hopping off the chair to leave the room. Varys moved out of the way near the door, so he was out of direct eyesight. Tyrion, get back here, snapped Tywin in response, making the dwarf turn on his heel, a bitter expression on his face. I can, and I do. Sansa was numb, watching the family spectacle in front of her. Across, lounging on his chair, Joffrey swung his legs around and sat up, laughing. It was almost a cackle. Congratulations, my lady. Survival instincts flooded her, and through bloodless lips, Sansa heard herself, from far away, say prettily, "Thank you, your grace." Apparently, Tywin was fooled by her words, despite her suddenly pale face. He turned back to his youngest. "And you, Tyrion, what do you say?" "What do I say?" repeated Tyrion, incredulously. "She's a child." "You should be thanking the gods for this," sneered Cersei, moving to a sideboard to pour herself some Arbor Gold wine. "This is more than you deserve." Joffrey still had a smile on his face, malicious glee in his eyes as he spoke directly to Sansa, who met the king's face head-on. "You'll be married to a Lannister. Soon you will have a Lannister baby. It's a dream come true for you, isn't it? What a glorious day." Sansa swallowed thickly, her fingernails digging viciously into the fleshy part of her hand. "Yes, your grace." It was as if Joffrey didn't hear her, however, as he continued speaking. "Although I suppose it doesn't really matter which Lannister puts the baby into you. Maybe I'll pay you a visit after my uncle passes out. How'd you like that?" Horror stole over Sansa as her worst fears began to play in front of her eyes. "You wouldn't?" asked Joffrey, lightly, but there was something dangerous in his words. "Well, that's all right. Selmern and Cerberus will hold you down." "That's enough, Joff. Tyrion will do as he's bid," said Tywin, glaring at first his grandson, who mullishly fell silent under the hard stare leveled on him, and then to Tyrion, who turned his back and stared out a nearby window. "As will you, Cersei." All heads swiveled in the queen's direction. Even Cersei, who had a smug smirk on her face, had the expression drop. Her arms, which were crossed, fell open at her sides. "What do you mean?" Tywin gave her a tight-lipped smile. "You'll marry Sarah Loras." "No!" thought Sansa, eyes growing wide at Margaery's sweet brother being forced to marry the shrewish and cruel queen. "I will not," laughed Cersei. Tywin's eyes narrowed. "Yes, you will. You're still fertile. You need to marry again and breed." "Breed," shrieked Cersei, her hands fisting at her side as her shoulders went up and she leaned forward towards her father. "I am Queen Regent, not some broodmare." "You're my daughter," the words thundered in the small room, rendering everyone momentarily senseless. No one had heard Tywin raise his voice that way before. "You will do as I command, and you will marry Loras Tyrell." Cersei took an aborted step forward, the red of her dress catching the fading sunlight as it filtered in through the window, turning it bloody and dark. "Father, don't make me do it again, please." Tywin was unmoved. Not another word. "My children." His gaze swept from Cersei to Tyrion, who was still ignoring him. There was a disgusted curl to his lip. "You've disgraced the Lannister name for far too long. Now, I shall go have Pycelle announce it. And Joff, you will give your blessing. With Sansa and Tyrion's upcoming nuptials, you can continue to woo and win Lady Margaery." When Joffrey went to protest, Tywin snarled, "That means now, Joffrey." The unhappy king rose to his feet and stomped through the room and out the door, snapping as he stepped out. "Hound, with me." Cersei, who twirled to watch her son leave the room, turned back to face her father, ire flashing in her face. "I won't allow this." Tywin rolled his eyes. "Yes, you will." The two left the room, Cersei chasing after her father, squabbling about her upcoming marriage, about Joffrey's. The silence that fell in the room was uncomfortable, and Sansa fought the urge to fidget. Her mother and Septa Mordane hated when she fidgeted. That was something Arya did instead, so she sat still, hoping not to draw anyone's attention. Finally, Tyrion swore under his breath and stalked over to the same sideboard Cersei had stood beside, pouring himself another drink. What a shit show. "And you, Daenerys, gods, man, you don't truly believe this about a witch in Robb Stark's camp?" Varys' eyes narrowed, and his head tilted slightly. Before all that familial nastiness, I was going to tell you the story of why I dislike magic. Do you want to hear it? Tyrion started, his eyes cutting straight to Sansa as he looked at her over his shoulder from pouring his drink. Sansa was surprised to realize he remembered she was there. "I don't know," he finally said, slowly. "Do I? Will it upset Lady Sansa?" There was a tiny shrug of voluminous yellow robes. If such a creature is allied with her brother, she should know what a witch is capable of. When no one said anything else, Varys nodded and began. "As a boy, in Myr, I traveled with a troupe of actors through the free cities. One day, a man approached my master with an offer too tempting to refuse. I feared the man meant to use me, as I'd heard some men use small boys, but what he wanted was far worse. He gave me a potion that made me powerless to move or speak, yet did nothing to dull my senses," the man said, his voice light and airy as though he was reciting a piece of news to the small council. Sansa swallowed, a part of her understanding what was coming next. "With a hooked blade, he sliced me, root and stem, chanting all the while. He burned my parts on a brazier." Sansa turned her head and tried not to gag. Varys sent her a sympathetic glance, but said, his voice stronger, "The flames burned blue, and I heard a voice answer his call. I still dream of that night. Not of the sorcerer, not of his blade. I dream of the voice. Was it a god, a demon, some conjurer's trick? I don't know, but the sorcerer called, and a voice answered. And ever since that day, I have hated magic and all who practice it." Tyrion hummed a little under his breath and walked over to his vacant chair next to Sansa. "And you think that this witch will do the same to Robb Stark, is capable of this?" Sansa paled further. "No, not Robb. Not more of my family. I don't want to be the only one left." "We know very little about her," admitted Varys slowly. "And what we do know is very different to any magic I have learned over the years. It is not a magic of Westeros or Essos. It is unknown. The unknown is dangerous." The man then turned and glided out of the room, leaving Sansa with horrifying visions of Robb being torn apart by some shadowy madwoman whose laugh sounded like Cersei's. "Well, this is quite the mess we find ourselves in." Sansa started and turned her head back around to face the short man at her side, at the table, where he was drumming his fingers thoughtfully. My lord?" He sighed. "Tyrion, Sansa. My name is Tyrion." He then gulped the rest of his wine noisily. "Can we, that is, will we?" She closed her eyes and stilled her breath, then opened her eyes and tried again, her voice strong. "Will the wedding be soon?" Tyrion shook his head, a strangled laugh emerging from him. "Not at all. It'll be a long engagement, astoundingly long." Sansa frowned. "What? Nick?" The man grinned at her, and Sansa was surprised to see such an open and friendly expression on a Lannister. "You have one. How old are you exactly?" Sansa paused. 16. "Well, talk won't make you any older," sighed Tyrion. "My lord father has commanded us to marry, and while we're here, it would be best to listen to the old man." Shakily, Sansa reached for his goblet, saw that there were a few gulps left, and quickly downed the rest of the bitter liquid. Tyrion snatched the now empty goblet from her hand. "Stop. Goodness, Sansa, I'm not that bad, am I?" "No, my lord," she blushed heavily under his mismatched eyes and turned her chin away. Tyrion sighed again, loudly and long. "Despite my father decreeing that we marry, nothing else will happen. My lady, if my father wants someone to get fucked, I know where he can start." There was a momentary pause, and then Sansa felt a hand touch one of hers in her lap. She whipped her head around to stare at him. "I won't share your bed. Not until you want me to." She swallowed, looking down at his hand on hers. She whispered, "What if I never want you to?" There was a bitter smile on Tyrion's face when he spoke. "And so my watch begins." He stood, slipping off the chair and holding his hand out to Sansa. "Come, I'll return you to your room. Not only must we prepare for our upcoming wedding, but we must prepare for Stannis when he arrives." Their walk back to her bedchambers was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Bronn trailed behind discreetly, never speaking, but a constant presence that Sansa was acutely aware of the entire time. Tyrion left her by her door, and she slipped inside, carefully shutting it and bolting it from an errant Kingsguard, or the king himself, from wandering in. "If I had to marry a Lannister," thought Sansa, "at least it's a kind one." She sighed and trudged over to a chair by the fire, where she had left an unfinished needlepoint project. Yet, as she passed her bed, something on the cover caught the glint of the fading sunlight coming from her window and balcony. She turned and frowned, inching forward, thinking someone left her a small dagger to end her misery. Instead, lying face up was a plain, silver or pewter-framed mirror, polished to a high shine. Sansa picked it up and admired her face in the polished lens. A long face, much of the baby fat long gone from stress, slight bags under her eyes, and pale, vibrant blue Tully eyes, framed by long, thin red hair in an elaborate hairdo favored by the Southron women in King's Landing. I am no longer the girl who believed in knights in shining armor, thought Sansa, her eyes sad and desperate for escape. She moved to put the mirror back down where she found it, not wanting to be accused of stealing, as Cersei would take joy in doing so when she realized that was something else on her bed. Tucked underneath the mirror had been a strange parchment with flowing cursive in an unfamiliar hand. Speak the name of your family, and it shall be heard. What in the mother's name is this? Wondered Sansa, her fingers tracing the strange script and odd instructions. Speak the name of my family? Do they mean Stark? Or someone like Robb? This is all very strange. My lady? Lady Sansa? Are you decent? Shay's voice broke into Sansa's thoughts. It's nearly time to get ready for the evening meal, my lady, and I have your dress. I'm here to do your hair as well. Sansa hurriedly stuffed the note and mirror under the corner of her bed cover, smoothing the fabric down. One moment, Shay, she called back. She then scurried to the door, promptly forgetting all about the mirror and note. She had other things to worry about in King's Landing.